This is a super sweet and thrilling comic. How can it not be thrilling when a supreme figure is about to be suppressed? The highly skilled Dr. Tsukaiji, after days of continuous surgeries without rest, suddenly suffers a myocardial infarction and dies, only to find himself transmigrated to ancient times. Tsukaiji always feels his head is heavy and foggy, with intermittent noises buzzing in his ears. Impatiently, he tears off the red veil covering his eyes, but when he takes in the scene before him, he's stunned. This is not a hospital at all. What kind of place is this? He desperately recalls everything that happened to him. He only remembers that he suddenly blacked out and lost consciousness. When he opened his eyes, he was here. Could it be that he passed away and transmigrated? He takes a moment to slowly accept this strange occurrence that cannot be explained by science. Suddenly anxious, he glances down at himself and breathes a sigh of relief when he sees that all his parts are still there. Thankfully, he is still a man. But the next second, confusion floods his mind again. If he is a man, why is he wearing a bridal gown? Just then, the memories of the original body flood into Tsukaiji's mind, attacking him like a rising tide. Tsukaiji can only close his eyes and passively endure the invasion of these external memories. The chaotic images flash through his mind one by one. He finally figures out the ins and outs of the situation. It turns out the original body was merely an assassin sent by Princeton to kill the emperor. To make the original body more obedient and compliant, that cruel Princeton also poisoned him. Thus, according to the plot's development, his mission this time is to assassinate the emperor. After successfully escorting the person to the royal chamber and the attendants have all dispersed, only Tsukaiji is left alone, contemplating how to save his own life. If he makes a move tonight, he won't be able to leave the imperial palace alive, carrying the crime of treason. Moreover, the black-hearted Princeton will likely push him out as the scapegoat. He carefully placed the hidden dagger under the pillow. But if he doesn't act tonight, he'll have to find a way to bluff the emperor first, then figure out how to get the antidote. As he was deep in thought, the door suddenly opened without warning. A tall, blurry figure barged into Tsukaiwu's sight. The visitor sat directly on the chair, propping their chin and looking at Tsukaiwu, speaking in a calm, unfluctuating tone. "Take off the veil yourself." The emperor's distant and indifferent voice completely fell into Tsukaiji's ears. Unexpectedly, the emperor's voice was quite pleasant. He just didn't know what he looked like. He reached out and slowly removed the obstructing veil. The man's appearance was completely exposed before Tsukaiwu's eyes. He was quite to his taste. After all, Tsukaiwu was a modern doctor, male in gender and attracted to men. The emperor glanced at him, then suddenly stood up, grabbed Tsukaiwu's chin, and inspected him seriously. "The woman prepared by my uncle is indeed beautiful." After saying that, he returned to his previous cold demeanor. "Take off your clothes." Tsukaiji was stunned and didn't move. The emperor seemed to be in a hurry, directly wrapped his arm around the beauty's waist, pulling him over. His voice was bewitchingly pleasant. "Since you won't undress yourself, I'll help you." Tsukaiwu could clearly feel the restless hand on his waist. Truly an impatient emperor. It seemed he had no choice. Before Tsukaiji could finish his thought, he was interrupted. The emperor directly grabbed his hand and lifted it above his head, his voice carrying a hint of dissatisfaction. "What are you thinking about, being so inattentive?" After speaking, he launched an attack, igniting fires all over the other's body. His long fingers caressed down from the waist. The indescribable sensation at his fingertips made the emperor's eyes widen. The person beneath him squinted slightly. Grabbing the emperor's shoulder, he swiftly flipped their positions. Tsukaiwu's hand, which had once held a scalpel, gently stroked that smooth skin, his voice full of playful reproach. "Your Majesty, you are quite impatient." The emperor, now pressed down, immediately exploded. "How dare you make such a move on me?" Tsukaiji's face showed no panic. Instead, he seductively whispered to the emperor, "Your Majesty, don't be angry. Why don't you try being underneath?" This episode is moving quickly. You know what I'm talking about. When Tsukaiwu suggested trying being underneath, the isolated king was stunned for a moment before he realized, "Riding? You are quite bold, beauty." Tsukaiwu smirked and laughed inwardly. "Riding?" Tsukaiwu never plays the bottom role. But just as he thought that, the emperor broke free from his restraint and shot him a fierce glare, then unceremoniously began to tear at his clothes. The light wedding garment came off with a gentle tug, revealing the man's strong physique completely. The intense visual impact stunned the isolated king, who took a long while to find his voice. "You are a man." He looked helplessly at his hand that had just been igniting fires everywhere. So, what he had just touched was really. Feeling deceived, the isolated king's face turned grim. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he furiously yelled at Tsukaiwu, "Do you realize this is deceiving the king? It's a beheading offense." Su Kaiwu was just about to say something to ease the situation but was interrupted by the intense coughing of the solitary king. He couldn't worry about anything else, pulled his clothes tighter, and hurried over. He supported the solitary king, who was frowning in discomfort, seemingly in respiratory distress triggered by the stimulus. He reached out to feel the king's neck, noticing swelling and a pronounced pulse. Then he moved his hand down to check the king's pulse, estimating it to be over 100 beats per minute, likely indicating tachycardia. Having identified the condition, it was time to treat it. He turned his gaze to the solitary king. Do you have any antiarrhythmic medication? But the solitary king seemed not to hear him, as he continued to gasp for breath. Receiving no answer, Su Kaiwu realized this wasn't the modern era. This backward dynasty likely didn't have such things, nor any equipment. His only option was the gag reflex technique, inducing nausea through throat stimulation to excite the nerves and slow the heartbeat. Su Kaiwu joined two fingers together and reached into the solitary king's mouth, then stirred inside wannily. The solitary king's fragmented sounds kept escaping his mouth, gradually wearing down the taut string inside Su Kaiji. His emotions began to show in his eyes. After a while, the solitary king's symptoms slowly stabilized, and the hand that had been gripping the bedsheet also gradually relaxed. Su Kaiwu timed it precisely before withdrawing his fingers, which were still coated with a suspicious transparent substance. He glanced at them and then turned his gaze back to the solitary king. Su Kaiji glanced at him before shifting his gaze to the solitary king, his voice neither well-intended yet filled with double meanings. Are you comfortable now? After the solitary king recovered, he remembered that there was something foreign in his mouth. Annoyed and embarrassed, he shoved Su Kaiwu away, his voice sounding even more frantic. How dare you be so disrespectful to me? Su Kaiwu shrugged indifferently. How can your majesty say that? I am your lifesaver after all. The solitary king didn't immediately scold him. Instead, he carefully straightened his clothes. Su Kaiji couldn't help but let out a light laugh, finding the young emperor rather innocent. I always felt that Su Kaiwu's mention of comfort had several hidden meanings, but I had no evidence. The young emperor, having recovered, became very wary of Su Kaiwu. What lifesaver? You clearly intended to take advantage of me. Su Kaiwu tilted his head, appearing unconcerned. Your majesty suffered from tachycardia, which with current medical conditions cannot be completely cured. Only methods like the one just used can relieve it. He then sighed as if helplessly. If I wanted to harm your majesty, just now was the perfect opportunity. Why would I bother relieving your discomfort? When it came to his medical condition, the solitary king's brow furrowed slightly. His condition did seem to improve faster than before. Who exactly was this person in front of him? He composed his expression and looked at Su Kaiwu. My royal physician has been treating me for many years without relief. Where did you learn your medical skills to know the illness at a glance? After saying that, he stared intently at him, afraid of missing any slight change on his face. Su Kaiji awkwardly avoided the piercing gaze and had to fabricate a lie. I've also suffered from heart disease since I was young. My family took me to visit an old traditional doctor, and I learned the method from him. Fearing the young emperor wouldn't believe him, he added cautiously, in terms of medical skills, I may not compare to your majesty's royal physician, but a folk doctor always has some unconventional methods. Having heard his words, the solitary king indeed believed him somewhat, but since this person's background was unknown, he decided to have someone investigate him thoroughly later on. Then what are your intentions? Do you intend to use this to blackmail me? Su Kaiwu stood up from his chair. You can probably guess why I was sent here, your majesty. The solitary king thought it was obvious that it was his kind royal uncle who sent him to cure him. But what puzzled him was that he didn't find any hidden weapons on Su Kaiwu. Could it be that he planned to use medical skills to act? As if seeing his doubts, Su Kaiji helplessly stated that he was just an ordinary person and didn't want to become a victim of this political struggle. The king raised the corners of his mouth. Do you know that just for saying this, I can cut off your head? Su Kaiji was not afraid of his threat at all. He reached out and patted the dust that didn't exist at all. His voice was full of sarcasm. Those imperial physicians of yours can only prescribe some trivial remedies. They wouldn't dare to do something as outrageous as what I just did. But I'm different. He reached out and wrapped his arm around the king's firm waist, pulling him over. I can make your majesty feel comfortable, can't I? The king frowned and remained silent for a long time, seemingly weighing the truth of these words. Su Kaiwu didn't disturb his weighing of pros and cons, let go of his waist, and walked towards the bed. He even boldly lay on the bed. Your majesty doesn't need to be so hostile towards me. I hope your majesty can consider it well. As he spoke, he quietly stuffed the hidden weapon under the pillow into his sleeve. As the lone king turned around about to say something, he was interrupted by Su Kaifog, who forcefully pulled him over, playing with his hair while speaking. Your majesty, do you wish to sleep on the floor tonight, or with me? Faced with the fierce advances of the beauty, Su Kaiji, can the Lone King resist? Although Su Kaiji has traveled from modern times, he seems to have no idea how to spell restraint. He hooked the Lone King's long hair, asking with a smile, "Do you want to sleep on the floor tonight, or with me?" The Lone King, incredulous, knocked his hand away. "What are you saying?" Su Kaifog hooked his lips and turned his gaze toward the door. "Today is the wedding night, your majesty surely can't go out now." The Lone King instinctively looked towards the door, seeing clearly the silhouettes of people outside. It seems his dear imperial uncle has even provided an audience for this drama. Su Kaiji seized the chance to add another shocker. "If your majesty goes out now and is seen by others, wouldn't it be a laughing stock to the world if they think your majesty is incapable?" This shocker was very effective. The Lone King hesitated for a moment but still compromised. However, he greatly disapproved of the decision Su Kaiji had made, pointing angrily at the clean yet cold ground. "You can't make me, a sovereign of a nation, sleep on the floor. What would that look like?" The more the Lone King spoke, the more he felt justified. He grabbed a pillow from the head of the bed and stuffed it into Su Kaifog's arms. "You roll over there and sleep." Su Kaifog chuckled, took the pillow out of his arms and placed it on the couch, not willing to compromise with the Lone King's decision at all. "I'll sleep here." Then, raising his beautiful eyes, he locked onto the Lone King. With a roll, he pinned the other person beneath him, considerately making decisions for the solitary king. "I believe your majesty also desires to share the bed with me," he said, pressing down a little more. The gap between them instantly vanished as his eyes shimmered with unusual emotions, and his hoarse voice was enough to bewitch anyone. Why not just do what should be done on this wedding night? Without waiting for an answer from the person below, Su Kaiji's hand, like a swimming fish, slipped into the solitary king's clothes, followed by a flurry of relentless advances. The solitary king, stimulated till the corners of his eyes reddened, began to lose control of his voice and breath.
I spared your life, but that doesn't mean you can be so presumptuous."
He was so angered that he kicked out, and with a thud, Su Kaiji landed safely on the ground. After successfully banishing the man from the bed, the solitary king lay back in self-satisfaction. "Go find somewhere else to sleep," he said. Su Kaiji watched the ungrateful one and curved his lips slightly. It took a while before he found a place to rest. For now, the solitary king was safe. Next, he needed to consider how to deal with An Wang and how to find an antidote before the onset of his illness. He stared at the person on the bed, lost in thought for a moment. The solitary king was now deeply asleep, dreaming away, devoid of his usual stern demeanor and fierceness. As he watched, sleepiness overtook him too, and he closed his eyes and fell into a deep sleep. Perhaps the best way for him to survive now was to rely on the emperor's protection. Finally, the two of them successfully ended up in the same bed. According to the limited memories in Su Kaiwu's mind, this was a fictional dynasty where royal and court power coexisted. This is a fictional dynasty where imperial and court powers coexist. The emperor ascended the throne at a young age and was too young to manage state affairs. As a result, the king of An, who is the emperor's fourth uncle, took advantage of this situation to become the regent, assisting, or more accurately, controlling, state affairs. But as the young emperor grew up, he began to develop his own sense of control and was no longer willing to be manipulated by the king of An. Consequently, he started to become less obedient. No one likes to see things go out of control, so the king of An, not wanting to do things by halves, planned to kill the emperor and take his place. His own attack was part of their plan. Meanwhile, although the surface of the king of An's mansion seemed calm, it was actually turbulent underneath. The king of An sat in his armchair listening to the report of his subordinate. The subordinate bowed respectfully, reporting the progress of the plan. "Your Majesty seems to have been attacked, but it's currently uncertain whether he's dead." The king of An's hand, which had been casually tapping on the table, paused for a moment, his eyes flashing with an ambiguous emotion. "Continue to monitor the situation and make sure to see 2 corpses by tomorrow. Do you understand?" At the other end, inside the royal palace, danger lurked. Several assassins, unnoticed by anyone, had arrived outside the emperor's sleeping quarters. They exchanged glances and began to blow into the room. As soon as the scent of the sleeping incense drifted in, the lonely king's eyes snapped open, alert. He straightened up and looked out the window. It seemed like he wouldn't get a good night's sleep tonight. He stared at the sleeping Su Kaiwu, thinking about how to prevent them from making contact. He didn't expect the man's alertness to be so high. As soon as he bent down, the man woke up. He was stunned for a moment, not knowing what to do. Su Kaiji, seeing their intimate posture, smiled and said, "Your Majesty, are you planning to take advantage of me while I'm asleep?" Before he could finish, someone covered his mouth. The king turned his head, motioning for him to look outside. Su Kaiwu looked over as well. Seeing the shadowy figures moving outside, he was speechless for a moment. How could there be a second wave? The king had been secretly observing the person beneath him. Seeing his reaction, he was stunned for a moment, wondering if he was completely unaware of this. He leaned in closer to ensure the man could hear him clearly. Come to bed with me. Don't make a sound. Suddenly, Su Kaiwu tiptoed towards the table, leaving the king looking at him in confusion. He watched as Su Kaiji soaked a towel in tea and then covered the king's nose and mouth with the wet towel. Your Majesty, use this. Simply covering with your hand won't work. A wet towel can reduce smoke concentration by up to 60%. Combined with the large space of the room, it should prevent us from being knocked out. Don't ask why two men are lying on the same bed. Of course, it's to chat under the covers. To avoid being knocked out by the smoke, the two men pressed the wet towel tightly and fell silent. The king stared at the person across from him for a while, then broke the eerie silence first. Tell me, what are Prince On's next plans? Su Kaiwu looked at the king innocently. Whether your Majesty believes it or not, I really don't know. The king muttered coldly, unsure whether to believe or not. Meanwhile, the assassins outside, seeing the guards completely down, figured it was about time to make a move. They pushed open the door and stealthily crept inside. The quilt on the bed bulged as if someone was hiding under it. After exchanging glances, the leading assassin drew his sword first, and aimed it at the lump. But before the sword could strike, it was flung away by an external force. The king secretly used the quilt to disorient the assassin leader's perception, and then quickly executed him with a throat lock. Yet, his face remained expressionless, indicating this wasn't his first encounter of this kind. Bold enough to face the king directly, the other assassins panicked upon seeing their leader fall but had no choice but to fight desperately. Su Kaiwu observed the fight from the bed, not fully grasping the situation but realizing it was an opportunity to gain the king's trust. So, he made his plan silently. The king, focused on the assailants, paid no attention to Su Kaiwu. Nor did he expect that Su had already targeted the assassin behind him, much less that he would suddenly charge forward. Taking a blade forcefully for himself, the cold long sword mercilessly pierced through Su Kaiji's flesh. The pain at the wound instantly swept through Su Kaiwu's brain, making him cry out in pain, his eyebrows knitted tightly together. He supported Su Kaiwu, swiftly dealing with the last assassin. Staring blankly at the assassins scattered on the ground, Su Kaiwu's shock temporarily overshadowed his pain. He hadn't expected the young emperor to be so capable. Before he could even reflect on it, blood spurted from his mouth. The lone king's brows furrowed even deeper, his tone became even more rigid. With that little ability, don't rush to throw your life away. Su Kaiwu, pained, closed his eyes, his voice weakened. I saw your Majesty being ambushed. There wasn't enough time to warn you, so I had to save you like this. Then, he reached out to grab the lone king's clothes, holding on tight as if afraid he would run away. I almost lost my life for your Majesty, you won't leave me unattended, right? After that night, the newly arrived consort Su, having made significant contributions, directly moved into Yongning Palace, and the news spread throughout the palace. The concubines in the palace began their schemes and intrigues once more, while the main character of the story, Su Kaiji, was completely unaware of it all. After this lesson of being stabbed, he decided to make some pain-killing medicine when he had time. Just then, a sharp voice interrupted him. Princeton has arrived. Su Kaiwu's heart skipped a beat. You've arrived quite early, he then switched to his incapable facade. The next second, Princeton pushed the door open and came in. Su Kaiwu immediately put on a shocked expression, looking at the person at the door. Princeton, how did you come? I never thought that one day, out of softness, I would share a bed with a male consort whose background I have not yet understood. Am I possessed? Previously, the sinister Princeton suddenly visited. Su Kaiwu had no choice but to open his useless mode to deal with it cautiously. To make the sinister Princeton lower his guard, he planned to play the victim first. Luckily, he narrowly escaped death. If the sword had been just 2 inches off, he might not have been able to see the prince again. With just a few words, the sinister prince dismissed all the servants. Su Kaiwu immediately grabbed Prince On's clothes, looking panicked. His voice was urgent, as if he had doubled the speed. Your Highness, please forgive me. I had no other choice but to come up with this plan. Then he looked at Princeton with a face full of grievance. The Emperor's vigilance is too high. His Majesty is too vigilant. He didn't even drink the nuptial wine. As soon as he came in, he started undressing me. I couldn't find any opportunity to act. Upon hearing this, King An merely smiled and said, no matter. His Majesty has always been cautious in his actions. As he spoke, he took out a small bottle from his chest pocket. You did well. Don't be nervous. I'm not here to blame you. This is a top-notch medicine for wounds. Apply it to the wound to speed up healing. Keep it with you. He then pretended to show some concern and walked out. This young emperor is more difficult to deal with than he had imagined. He almost fell into a trap yesterday. He discreetly glanced back. But this person cannot be fully trusted now. He has to find an opportunity to get rid of him. Time quickly passed until evening. The king was strolling around the palace. He paused when he reached Yongning Palace, where Su Kaiwu resided. The old servant who had served him for many years immediately rushed out from behind, wearing a very amiable smile. "Your Majesty, are you planning to stay overnight at Yongning Palace?" The king frowned in displeasure. "What? Do I have to report to you whatever I want to do?" The old servant quickly shook his head and waved his hands, saying, "No, the servant wouldn't dare. It's just that the matter of staying overnight needs to be arranged and recorded in the palace ledger." The king waved his hand and said, "No need," and went straight to Yongning Palace. The old servant watched the direction he was heading and was overjoyed in his heart. "Has your Majesty finally come to his senses? Despite having so many concubines before, your Majesty didn't favor a single one, which really worried him." The king stared directly at Su Kaiwu and got straight to the point. "Did my good royal uncle visit you today? What did he say?" To a certain extent, the king and he could be considered allies. So Su Kaiji didn't hide anything. Indeed, he came. He just said a few words of concern. He wouldn't be foolish enough to say anything outrageous in the palace, right? The king raised his eyebrows. "Didn't he give you anything?" Seeing his worried look, Su Kaiji proactively approached, and as he began to speak, a warm wave of heat enveloped his words. "If your Majesty is not at ease, you can search me yourself." To save him embarrassment, Su Kaiji directly grasped his hand and placed it on his body. "There aren't many places on me to hide anything, your Majesty will know with just a touch." The prince merely glanced at him indifferently and withdrew his hand. "Still restless even when injured, aren't you afraid that I might take your life on a whim?" Su Kaiwu immediately put on an injured puppy look. "Is this how your Majesty treats your lifesaver? I see you're not seriously hurt. Rest well on your own tonight." Seeing him about to leave, Su Kaiji instinctively caught his clothing, his voice as feeble as a defenseless patient. "Your Majesty, you can't leave. What if Prince An sends someone to kill me tonight?" The prince smirked. "It has always been I who decide the comings and goings of my consorts, no one dares to stop me from leaving." As soon as the words fell, the person leaned in closer, and the warm tone heated up the atmosphere rapidly. "Isn't there someone right now? Besides, I am not a consort." This episode will successfully capture its tsundere little emperor. Su Kaiwu didn't expect his flirtation to backfire, causing him self-harm instead. The little emperor, provoked, extended his hand to push him away, apparently to break through this warm atmosphere, but coincidentally, he pushed right onto his wound. Caught off guard, Su Kaiwu's face paled from the pain. Hearing the muffled groan, the little emperor felt a twinge of remorse. The image of him bravely shielding Su Kaiwu from a knife that night flashed through his mind, and his heart ached all the more for Su Kaiwu. He turned his head and coughed to hide his discomposure. Then he pretended to have no choice but to lie on the bed. Just this once, watching his proud demeanor, Su Kaiwu's smile grew wider. "Pretty cute." He reached out and touched the Lone King's clothes, looking at the little tsundere with a coconut-like expression. "Your Majesty, do you sleep without taking off your clothes?" Seeing the little emperor still not paying attention to him, Su Kaiwu suddenly felt like teasing. His nimble fingers slid down along the person's collarbone. Just as he was about to peek inside the clothes, he was caught. The little emperor, without even opening his eyes, accurately grasped his restless hand. "If you don't want to sleep, I don't mind throwing you out to play with the assassins." Su Kaiji watched their intertwined hands with great pleasure. Then he lay down obediently and slept. How could he miss the opportunity to share a bed with His Majesty? The next morning, sunlight sneaked in, waking the little emperor. For some reason, he had slept exceptionally peacefully. He moved to get up but found himself trapped in a warm embrace. He reached to his waist, trying to move the claw away, but suddenly heard a dissatisfied protest from beside him. The voice sounded sticky, seemingly half awake. With a headache, he frowned but closed his eyes again. "After my injury heals, I'll settle the score with you." As he fell asleep again, the person beside him opened his eyes. Su Kaiji, seeing his tightly furrowed brows, couldn't help but curve his lips, then continued to stare at him, wondering what he was thinking. During the day, the young emperor was reviewing documents with a stern look on his face, as if a storm was brewing. The sight terrified the old servant, who kept backing away until he saw Su Kaiwu at the door and finally breathed a sigh of relief. A savior had arrived. He scolded the servants blocking Su Kaiwu from entering. He then cheerfully let the person in. "Lady Su, what brings you here? You haven't fully recovered yet." Su Kaiwu cocked her head, understandingly spoke up, "It's nothing. His Majesty didn't rest well last night. I specifically made some nourishing soup for him. Upon hearing this, the old servant's eyes lit up with joy. Your ladyship is so thoughtful. Please, come in. Su Kaiwu carried the nourishing soup inside herself. Everyone else wisely left, and, understandingly, closed the door behind them. Your Majesty, may I come in? The young emperor looked up. Why, isn't spending the night together not enough? Now you wish to share my room during the day as well? So, what exactly did Su Kaiwu do last night that made the young emperor unable to sleep well? Su Kaiwu bent down to place the nourishing soup on the table. I specifically came to bring your Majesty some nourishing soup. Then, taking advantage of the bending posture, she leaned close to the emperor's ear. Your Majesty, drink this, and I will give you a massage to help you relax. The emperor slowly picked up the nourishing soup. Under Su Kaijia's superb massage techniques, he or she, comfortably closed, his/her, eyes, but, his/her, mouth still wouldn't let anyone off. But his mouth refused to show mercy. He snorted coldly. The culprit here is pretending to be a good person. Su Kaiwu maliciously leaned closer, his mouth just millimeters from his ear. Sorry for keeping your Majesty up all night, he said it, but there was no trace of guilt on his face. Then he withdrew a few inches, but the hot breath still hit the emperor's ear. I'm here to make it up to your Majesty. The emperor's sensitive ears visibly turned red. It's unclear whether he was reminded of last night or if the waves of hot breath reddened them. The old servant outside wished he could pierce through the door and windows just to see the scene inside. Seeing two blurry figures close together, he became as happy as a child. In the past, he had never seen the emperor so intimate with any concubine. It seems concubine Su will be well taken care of in the future. Su Kaiwu diligently massaged him. Suddenly, he heard him speak, headaches. My heart condition. Do you have a cure? Su Kaiji's hands paused in the massage. He walked from behind the emperor to stand in front of him. Looking at him without evasion, he spoke, with the current medical conditions, it can't be cured. A loud bang was heard as the emperor slammed his palm on the table in anger. He stared at Su Kaiji intensely. What did you say? Su Kaiwu was not afraid of his threats. He returned his gaze without wavering. I said, your heart condition. I can't cure it for now. As soon as he finished speaking, the emperor's face darkened, and his tone showed signs of anger. Have I been too indulgent with you lately? He suddenly stood up from his seat, grabbed Su Kaiwu's slender neck, and threatened, do you really think I dare not touch you? With a bang, the door was violently flung open as the emperor stormed out in a rage. Then he threw it on the ground without any pity. You just stay in the room and develop the medicine until you can cure Gu's heart disease. Su Kaiwu grunted in dissatisfaction. He looked at him pitifully, but this time the emperor was not soft-hearted. After saying a few words, he was about to turn around and leave. If you need anything, just tell Eunuch Joe. He will bring it. After speaking, he closed the door with a bang. Su Kaiwu stared at the closed door and curled his lips. This is good too. Now that he has time and tools, he can study the poison in his body. He took out the medicine bottle given by Princeton and took a look. Princeton really knows how to play. He said it was some kind of wound medicine. The smell of the ingredients was off. It seems he needs to spend some time researching the components inside to formulate an antidote. Night quietly approached. Su Kaiwu was studying the ingredients of the medicine when he noticed a shadow outside the door. He quickly hid the medicine bottle. The next second, the emperor pushed the door open and came in. A day has passed. How is the progress? These two little things are so cute. Don't miss them if you pass by. The little emperor made a surprise inspection and asked how Su Kaiji's research was going. Su Kaiwu calmly presented the well-memorized solution, saying, to fundamentally cure His Majesty's heart disease, we first need to conduct an ECG test, and then, depending on the situation, perform a cardiac radiofrequency ablation surgery for treatment. The young emperor rubbed his temples in frustration and closed his eyes, asking for a simpler explanation. With a light chuckle, Su Kaiji opted for a shorter explanation. In simple terms, we need to use a device to check His Majesty's body condition, and then insert a catheter for electrotherapy. He tilted his head, his tone full of helplessness, adding, but the biggest problem now is that we have no electricity. The young emperor looked at him with a puzzled face, his little head filled with questions. What is electricity? Su Kaiji suddenly found himself at a loss for words, wondering how to explain the concept of electricity to the young emperor. He pondered for a long time with a frown. Then, a light bulb went off in his head. Lightning. Yes, lightning. He looked excitedly at the young emperor. The lightning in the sky, Your Majesty knows about it, right? The young emperor felt a headache coming on and incredulously asked, are you suggesting I should be struck by lightning? Su Kaiwu helplessly massaged his forehead. Let's not talk about this for now. He paused before continuing, The simplest is taking medication, metoprolol tartrate tablets. You've never heard of them, right? The young emperor defiantly flicked his wide sleeves. Although I've never heard of them, couldn't I just order someone to find the materials and make them? Is there anything in this world that I cannot obtain? Hearing this, Sukai Wu felt even more helpless but had no choice but to continue exploring options on the edge of death. This medicine is not like common Chinese medicine that can be manually prepared, it requires machines. His subtle pause annoyed the young emperor, who laughed sarcastically. After all this, I see you don't value your life. Sukai Wu was the type to hold grudges. He mentally noted the young emperor's threats, planning to return the favor one day. However, outwardly, he had to appear obsequious. Your Majesty, I have many other methods to try. In the meantime, I will research the machines I mentioned. He stared at the emperor and slowly stood up. Firstly, there are daily habits that your Majesty needs to change. Fearing the young emperor's anger, Sukai Wu immediately started massaging and kneading his shoulders, then slowly explained the reasons. You can't always drink tea. There are also things in tea that can easily trigger your heart disease. But like the medicinal soup I gave His Majesty yesterday, His Majesty can drink it daily. Then, with some massage, it can reduce the number of times His Majesty suffers from the illness. Saying this, he leaned closer and closer, stopping at the boundary between normalcy and warmth. Why don't we try it now? The young emperor looked at him, puzzled. Try what? Su Kaiji didn't answer but directly started the practical operation. His slender fingers gently tapped on the young emperor's chest. This neither light nor heavy tapping made the young emperor feel a ticklish heart. It was hard to define this strange feeling simply as comfortable or uncomfortable. Su Kaiwu, as if he didn't notice his abnormality, continued his practical operation and his calm explanation. For headaches, massage the head. For heart disease, well, of course, massage the chest area. Saying this, he seriously reached out to untie the young emperor's belt. Moreover, this massage must have the fingers directly touching the skin. If it's done over the clothes, the effect will be lost. The young emperor's face darkened. A storm brewing in his demeanor. Are you mocking me? The beauty makes a high-profile entrance. Let's see where the arrogant little emperor can run off to now. There has been no progress on the assassin matter, and the young emperor is extremely annoyed. He knows the assassin was sent by his dear uncle, yet he can't find any evidence and thus can't do anything about it. With a gloomy face, he orders the captain of the guard to be dragged away and beaten with 30 planks. The captain of the guard has always been diligent and responsible. Knowing that he has failed in his duties this time, he bows his head and willingly accepts the punishment. Then, the emperor takes out a stack of papers, his voice so cold it could freeze. But during the search, we found some things in some people's homes that shouldn't have been there. His expression grew even grimmer, his sharp gaze piercing like invisible blades, harshly tormenting the people in front of him. Minister Jiang, do you plead guilty? The mentioned Minister Jiang immediately panics, kneeling and begging for mercy. Your Majesty, I admit my guilt. I was momentarily blinded by greed and accepted ill-gotten gains. Please grant me another chance, Your Majesty. Everyone has a set of excuses for the mistakes they've committed, claiming ignorance or a momentary lapse in judgment, as if a well-found excuse can cover up their crimes. The young emperor has heard too many of these excuses and doesn't want to listen any longer. With a wave of his hand, he orders the man to be dragged away. Eunuch Zhou, who has been secretly observing from outside, is sweating profusely. The emperor seems to be in an even worse mood than yesterday. It seems he needs to think of some solutions. Wasn't it just a quarrel with Consort Su? Couples quarrel and make up all the time. Perhaps it's time for him to stir things up a bit. The young emperor, with a displeased face, walks ahead, while Eunuch Zhou follows behind with small, laborious steps until they enter the imperial study. It's then that Eunuch Zhou finds the opportunity to speak. Your Majesty seems to be in a bad mood today. Would you like this old servant to order the imperial kitchen to prepare some sweet soup? The young emperor is in no mood for anything and doesn't feel like eating. He waves his hand to dismiss him. You may leave. Without my order, no one is allowed in today. Thinking of the restless individual, he specifically adds, especially that Consort Su. She is not allowed in. Eunuch Zhou reluctantly agrees. Yet in his heart, he was figuring out how to add a twist. That night, the little emperor returned to his palace bathed in moonlight. As soon as he entered, he was stunned. What's with this mist? Curiously, he walked inside. He saw Su Kaiwu, who had dressed up specially, with colorful mist swirling around him. Truly a beautiful sight. He looked at the person lightly, his voice emotionless. Haven't I said that no one is allowed in without my order? Su Kaiwu responded calmly. Your Majesty mentioned the imperial study, not here. The emperor, pointing at the mist, asked helplessly, did you do this too? Su Kaiwu smiled slightly, clearly not. With things having reached this point, aside from the audacious eunuch Zhou, who else would dare to do this? The little emperor glanced towards the door, thinking he had indeed been too indulgent. Now so presumptuous. Caught off guard, eunuch Zhou immediately slipped away, fast as if flying. Wishing His Majesty and the Empress reconcile soon. Su Kaiwu naturally closed the door that connected to the outside. Your Majesty, don't blame him. Eunuch Zhou is also worried about your health. Shall we have a drink? Having seen all kinds of hypocrisy and high-grade green tea, this was his first encounter with high-grade mint. The little emperor, looking at Su Kaiwu busying himself, voiced a soul-searching question. What are you planning to do tonight what wasn't done on our wedding night? Su Kaiji, feeling helpless, closed his eyes. Why does your Majesty always think so ill of others? Saying this, he poured himself another cup of wine. A little drink is good for sleep. Your Majesty, drink and rest early. The little emperor immediately blurted out about their last experience sharing a bed, saying, I won't share a bed with you. Before he could finish, Su Kaiji interrupted him. I know, I'll sleep on the floor tonight, and then passed him the cup of wine. The little emperor then took the wine cup and began to drink, savoring the fine wine. Suddenly, a fresh minty smell hit him. Su Kaiji, with a face full of grievance, opened his mouth and said, although my wounds haven't healed, it's okay for me to sleep on the cold floor. The little emperor almost choked to death on the spot and coughed for a long time before he recovered. The man was still trying his best to play the role of the mint. As long as your Majesty rests well, I can endure anything. Your Majesty need not worry about me. The little emperor pursed his lips, at a loss for how to react. The little emperor lay in bed but couldn't fall asleep, tossing and turning with Su Kaiji's words on his mind. He turned over, thinking that the person was so delicate, he wouldn't really get sick from sleeping on the floor, right? Unexpectedly, the little emperor's words turned out to be prophetic. Indeed, Su Kaiji really fell ill, catching a cold and coughing incessantly, which made Steward Zhou very worried. Su Kaiji helplessly stated that he was just a bit cold and it was nothing serious. Steward Zhou, with tears, said that last night's strategy was very effective, but it was hard on Su Fei Niang. His Majesty was much gentler today and didn't blame him. It seems that His Majesty still likes to be with Su Fei Niang. The two of them chatted back and forth and established a revolutionary friendship. Either way, I deliberately didn't bring the medicine soup for the lady. I'll wait for His Majesty to come down from court and let His Majesty bring it to her. Su Kaiji, knowing the importance of catering to one's preferences, took the opportunity to inquire from Steward Zhou what the little emperor liked. Steward Zhou, with a smile on his face, was obviously very satisfied with Su Fei taking the initiative to care about the emperor's matters. His Majesty usually likes to listen to the Qin when he's free. Listening to the Qin. Right. But if you plan to prepare, try to find some simple and elegant Qin players. If you find those covered in rouge and face powder, His Majesty will be furious. Upon hearing this, Su Kai made an expression of understanding. Noted, thank you for the advice, Eunuch Zhou. Eunuch Zhou quickly waved his hands, saying, not at all, not at all. In the future, I still need to rely on Her Majesty's support. It's really tough for the ancients to be sick, with no TV or cell phones, nothing to do but lie down. He was about to get up and find something to amuse himself. Just as he was about to get up and find some entertainment, the young emperor arrived. He quickly shrank back. The young emperor started by coughing twice seemingly casually. I heard you caught a cold last night. He immediately turned into a drama king, pretending to be frail and weak, coughing, my lord, I'm indeed ill. The naive young emperor instantly felt extremely guilty, his voice unconsciously lowered. Was it wrong of me last night? He couldn't finish his sentence and instead handed over the medicine soup. Stiffly, he said, drink the medicine. Su Kaiji didn't take it, just looked up at him. Your Majesty is unaware, the temperature of the medicine has to meet strict requirements. The young emperor frowned in disbelief. You're not suggesting I test the temperature for you, are you? Again with personally testing and feeding medicine, and coming up with new tricks. What exactly is going on in this episode? Su Kaiwu looked at the medicine soup handed over by the young emperor and softly said, Your Majesty is unaware, the temperature of the medicine has to meet strict requirements. The young emperor somewhat embarrassingly said, You're not suggesting I test the temperature for you, are you? Seeing the young emperor's reaction, it was clear he was reluctant. It seems a stronger incentive is needed. Su Kaiwu put on a pitiful look, like an injured puppy. He coughed deliberately, I'll do it myself, it's okay, the temperature doesn't have to be perfect. The young emperor, with a heart as soft as tofu but a sharp tongue, couldn't help but soften. He left a spoonful of medicine in his mouth. The temperature of the medicine was just right, not too hot or cold. He was about to say the temperature was just right. But Su Kaiji beat him to it, moving closer and grabbing the hand with the spoon, then leaning in, past the spoon. His eyes were fixed on the young emperor, as if conveying a warm message. The young emperor couldn't stand those eyes filled with too many messages and quickly stepped back several steps, then turned angrily towards the instigator. How audacious! Su Kaiji shows no fear of his dragon's presence, with a hint of a smile on his lips. Is this what you call audacious? Your Majesty, I have even bolder things prepared for you. Upon hearing this, the young emperor's tone turns cold. Didn't I order you to only study medicine in your room? Su Kaizuo lifts his head to meet the gaze of the person before him. I am not a canary. Does your Majesty wish to keep a beauty hidden? As soon as he finishes speaking, the young emperor narrows his eyes, and a dangerous aura instantly envelops the room. Are you defying my orders? Su Kaiwu immediately surrenders. Not at all, not at all. I have already informed the servants to prepare the materials needed for the medicine. He strokes his chin in thought. Besides, I have no tools right now, keeping me locked up is pointless. Wouldn't it be better to find some amusement for your Majesty, right? The next day is bright and clear, and the imperial garden is full of life. For some unknown reason, the young emperor follows Su Kaiwu to this place, wondering what new tricks are at play. Su Kaizuo remembers that last time, eunuch Zhou said the young emperor loves to listen to the Guqin, 0. So he had instructed his servants early to find renowned Guqin players from the market, thinking that the young emperor would like this surprise. As he thinks, a smile becomes more apparent on his lips. After arriving at the agreed place, Su Kaiwu gestures grandly toward the Guqin players. The young emperor follows his direction and his expression becomes indescribable. Is this the surprise you mentioned? Su Kaiwu, puzzled, looks on, and then his eyes widen like bronze bells. He sees the Guqin players, each with thick rouge and gaudy powder, all the while casting flirtatious glances at the young emperor. The emperor closes his eyes and laughs helplessly, his tone unexpectedly conveying, Consort Su, you truly kill without a trace. Su Kaiji felt utterly embarrassed and, with a face full of dismay, turned to ask the servant, why did you bring this thing here? The servant claimed it was per his instructions. Su Kaiji felt a headache coming on and waved his hand, dismissing the servant hastily. Now, the surprise had turned into a shock. Let's see how the beautiful man Su Kaiji coaxes his wife. Isn't such a tsundere little emperor easy to handle? The little emperor felt a headache just looking at the pile of garish makeup. He couldn't stand to stay here a moment longer. Su Kaiwu, carrying the long skirt for mopping, quickly followed, Your Majesty, wait for me. The little emperor, seemingly in a huff, walked faster and faster. Su Kaiwu had no choice but to walk and explain that it was just an accident. But the little emperor was not impressed, pressing his temples which were beginning to ache, his voice as cold as ever. It seems Empress Su knows exactly how to give me a headache. Su Kaiwu's gaze, unnoticeably, fell upon those incessantly moving thin lips. How could that be? Everyone wishes to win your favor, Your Majesty. Who would want to give you a headache? Saying this, he quickened his pace and moved ahead of the little emperor, who looked at him, puzzled, not knowing what trick he was up to. Suddenly, Su Kaiji stopped, turned, and bent down to meet his gaze, every movement like a slow-motion scene in a movie, playing over and over in the little emperor's heart. Su Kaiji's voice took on a more cajoling tone, Your Majesty, though you can't hear the chin, the weather is so nice today. How about we take a walk? The little emperor sidestepped him, his gaze inscrutable. Who knows if Empress Su has any more surprises for me? Su Kaiwu immediately swore earnestly, how could that be? I swear there's nothing else. Saying this, he clung to him again, taking the little emperor's arm to prevent him from fleeing. I heard that the daisies are especially beautiful today. Your Majesty, come with me to see them. Without waiting for the little emperor to react, he dragged him away. The maids watching this scene were shocked. Empress Su is so daring to cling to His Majesty. If it were someone else, they would have been dragged away and beheaded by now. Rumors started to spread, initially just about the emperor favoring Empress Su exclusively. But once it reached the harem, it blew up. A maid rushed in from outside, exclaiming, something terrible has happened, Your Majesty. I just heard that it's being spread around that His Majesty, for the sake of Consort Su, is going to expel all the other women from the palace. This rumor caused an uproar in the palace, but the main character of the story was completely unaware of it. Meanwhile, Princeton was waiting for his subordinates to report back, tapping his fingers on the table irregularly. Any new information? Any new messages? The subordinate replied respectfully, I heard that Consort Su is enjoying the Emperor's favor alone today. Princeton raised his eyebrows in surprise, is that so? Absolutely true? Should I make further arrangements? Princeton slowly picked up the brush on the desk and leisurely began to write on the paper. A few days ago, the Emperor was furious and dismissed several officials, right? It's time to place some new people in. Since Consort Su is currently enjoying the Emperor's favor, let's entrust this matter to her. Welcome to this episode of The Lonely Prince Below, your commentary live. I'm your host, Xiao Ba. Su Kaiwu was leisurely strolling in the palace, the breeze caressing his cheeks, pleasant and comfortable. He would have been very happy if he hadn't been bumped into. But fate always had other plans, as a careless servant bumped straight into Su Kaiwu, their hands covertly exchanging something in the process. A moment later, the servant seemed to realize he had bumped into a noble and hurriedly knelt down to beg for mercy. Su Kaiwu tightened his grip on the note. "It's all right, you can go." After returning to his room, Su Kaiwu looked worried. That note was like a death sentence hanging over his neck. He didn't know how to react for a moment. Just when he was feeling frustrated, the young emperor arrived. He rubbed his troubled face vigorously before getting up to greet the visitor. However, the feeling of frustration still lingered. The young emperor sat down on his own and, seeing the worried expression on his face, unconsciously furrowed his brow. "Why do you look so strange? Is there something you want to tell me?" Su Kaiji didn't know how to organize his words to explain, so he simply handed over the note for him to see. After reading it, the young emperor didn't express an opinion but instead calmly asked Su Kaiji what he thought should be done. Su Kaiji thought for a moment. Although he knew nothing about politics, he understood that he couldn't let the position fall into the hands of the antagonist. As he was pondering how to answer the question, he happened to glance at the flower pot nearby. An idea struck him. He took a branch from one flower and grafted it onto another slanted branch. The transplanted flower could bloom just as well. It was truly amazing. The young emperor looked at him in puzzlement and timely let out a questioning sound. Su Kaiji slowly straightened up. He then quietly sat down beside him, his hand easily climbing up the emperor's arm. "But what I say may not be right. Your Majesty is so wise, you will surely come up with a perfect solution." As he spoke, he secretly lowered the bed curtain, pressing his entire body closer step by step. "As your Majesty's concubine, I should serve your Majesty's body well." With long, slender, and well-defined fingers, he unhurriedly peeled off the inner and outer garments, revealing a large area of smooth and flawless skin and a captivatingly deep collarbone. With such an alluring figure, how could Su Kaiji remain composed? He suddenly leaned in, those thin lips of his soul were near, but before they could touch, the young emperor raised his hand to block him. "Just focus on making medicine and don't cause trouble," he said. Su Kaiwu didn't reply, closing his eyes to carefully feel the sensation on his lips. Warm and soft, he wondered if those thin lips that opened and closed were also this tender. The next morning during the court session, the temporarily vacant minister position was indeed brought up. The officials all urged the emperor to appoint a new candidate. Seizing the opportunity, the young emperor voiced his prepared plan. "Someone has recommended Yi Qing to me. What does everyone think?" The head official, feeling somewhat embarrassed, responded, "Yi Qing is known to have good conduct, but appointing him as minister might be too significant a promotion." Contrary to expectations, the young emperor did not agree with the official. "I believe Yi Qing has the talent for this position and is worthy of promotion," he said. Meanwhile, the fresh-looking guard called Su Kaiji's sister. "How should we handle this?" Hearing the emperor say Yi Qing was a good candidate for promotion, and Wang couldn't help but curl his lips, displaying a victorious stance. But the next moment, his smile froze on his face. The emperor saw every subtle change in his expression. Just as Wang thought he had won, the emperor doused his hopes with cold water. "Yi Qing indeed needs a promotion, but appointing him as minister is inappropriate. Let's send him to Shangzhou as the administrative commissioner." As soon as these words fell, Wang's expression darkened. His hands clenched into fists, nails digging deeply into his palms without feeling the pain. But his face burned with embarrassment. He had underestimated the young emperor. This move killed two birds with one stone. Not only did it promote Yi Qing, but it also nullified one of his chess pieces. After the court session, Wang called out to the emperor. The emperor, indifferent, turned his head to look at him. "What is it, Uncle Emperor? I have some acquaintance with Yi Qing, and now that he has been promoted by your Majesty, why don't I host a banquet tonight and celebrate with the officials?" The emperor, all business, nodded politely yet distantly. "Then I shall leave the arrangements to you, Uncle Emperor. I will also attend this evening." After saying that, he left without looking back. There was a lingering gloom between Prince On's brows as he turned around. So much for enjoying the emperor's favor. If he can't even handle such a trivial matter, let alone kill the emperor. If he's no longer useful, he might as well be dead for safety. Meanwhile, Su Kai had no idea he was being watched, just idly passing time by himself, completely unaware that danger was stealthily approaching. Suddenly, without warning, the candle went out. The room was plunged into darkness, making it even more dangerous for Su Kai, who had no martial arts skills. A sword came at him, gleaming in the dark. He swiftly turned his head, narrowly escaping. He was lucky to save his life but not his few pitiful strands of hair. This prince really knew when to pick his moment. It seemed he had planned this, choosing to strike when the emperor was away. The assassin, sword in hand, struck again. Perhaps feeling that this time he was surely a goner, Su Kai simply gave up struggling and even closed his eyes, consoling himself. After all, it wasn't his first time dying. It wasn't the first time dying anyway, but the imagined pain didn't come. Instead, the sound of weapons clashing was clearly heard. He opened his eyes in confusion, and what came into view was the back of a long-haired man. After the man blocked the assassin, he turned to look at Su Kai Wu. He comforted her softly, "Don't be afraid, sister consort. Hide behind me, I will protect you." Su Kai Wu then saw the man's appearance clearly: fair glowing skin, deep red copper eyes, looking like a naive pup. The naive pup-like guard quickly dealt with the assassins. He didn't forget to mock them with a few more words: "Commendable courage, but your skills are too poor." Then he immediately changed his expression as he turned back. "Sister consort, are you all right?" He then confidently claimed, "Look, with my protection, sister consort is definitely unharmed." Su Kaiji silently glanced at the hair that had been cut off by the assassin earlier and didn't expose the young man's lie. After all, he had saved her. Why did he seem so indifferent on the surface, yet secretly sent a shadow guard to protect her? The shadow guard sent by the young emperor was called Qing Xuan, a naive pup with fair skin, good looks, and a soft voice. Hearing Qing Xuan call the young emperor emperor brother, Su Kai Wu couldn't contain her curiosity and asked, "Are you the emperor's brother?" Qing Xuan immediately shook his head like a rattle drum. "Of course not. It's because I was raised as a shadow guard since childhood. When I was young, I didn't understand and called him that. He didn't mind, so I never changed it and have called him that ever since." Su Kaiji stared at the ground in thought. It seems the young emperor was quite gentle in the past. If it were now, he would probably be dragged away immediately. Her calmness and composure in the face of danger surprised Qing Xuan. "Sister consort, aren't you afraid of assassins? How do you still have the mind to care about me?" Su Kaiji raised his hand and gently rubbed his head, his tone calm yet somewhat helpless. "What use is fear? Only by staying calm can we find a glimmer of hope." Hearing his words, Qing Xuan suddenly saw the light and felt even more admiration for him. "That makes sense. Sister Feizi is so impressive." Su Kaiji should have been happy to be praised, but looking at the heroic corpses on the ground, he couldn't feel any joy. Qing Xuan seemed to notice his concern, crossed his arms, and promised to quickly give him a clean room. With that, he started to clean up the scene cheerfully. Su Kaiji's mind was in turmoil. He completely couldn't understand what the young emperor was thinking. Although he appeared indifferent to him, secretly he had specially assigned shadow guards to protect him. A call of "Your Majesty" brought his drifting thoughts back. He moved his eyes and shifted his gaze to the door, where the hurried young emperor came into view, clearly having rushed back from outside. His heart suddenly softened, and with a pitiful look, he gave the young emperor a bear hug. "Your Majesty, you finally returned. I was so nervous, afraid I would never see you again." The young emperor was also nervous and scared. Realizing that Prince An's banquet was to distract him, his heart was in his throat during the assassination. He allowed Su Kaiji to hug him without breaking free, waiting for his heart to calm down. He raised his hand, wanting to pull him into his arms, but the next second, thinking it inappropriate, he changed the direction of his hand. Grabbing his shoulders, he pushed him away. His voice remained calm, betraying no inner struggle. "It seems Qing Xuan protected you well." Su Kaiji smiled slightly. "It's all thanks to Your Majesty's foresight. I didn't expect His Majesty to still be thinking about me even after attending the banquet. I'm so touched." The young emperor found it amusing and pulled away the restless hand, saying with feigned sincerity, "I'm thinking about your skills." The other party turned their head aside and muttered discontentedly, "His Majesty is just being stubborn." The young emperor heard this and coolly replied, "I advise you to watch your words and deeds. Nowadays, my good uncle wishes he could get rid of you as soon as possible." He suddenly leaned in close, their foreheads touching, breaths intertwining, and even his voice carried a warm tone. "Now it's not me who needs you, but you who needs my protection. Humans are very strange creatures. No matter how much they detest the other person, as long as they wear a human mask, they can smile and chat with them pleasantly. But I wonder how these uninvited harem sisters will react when they find out Su Kaiwu is a man." The young emperor's sudden coldness towards him last night made Su Kaiwu anxious. This is not a good sign. He must find a way to regain control. As he was contemplating how to regain control, those plastic harem sisters arrived. He put on a smile and stood up to greet the newcomers. "Sisters, what brings you here today?" Concubine Cha immediately hooked her hand around his arm with a smile. Sister Su has been in the palace for a while now. Normally, you should have come to greet your elder sisters earlier. But since you've been enjoying the Emperor's favor recently, you naturally wouldn't have the time. So we had to come to you personally. Su Kaiwu showed a deeply apologetic expression, but inside he wished he could curse their entire ancestry. This TV drama didn't lie, not only are the schemes the same, but even the lines are similar. Yet he had no choice but to deal with such boring antics. It's my oversight, sister. Please don't blame me. As long as she keeps up appearances well, the title of Mother of Kindness is hers. Tea consort first generously forgave Su Kaiji, then offered him specially prepared pastries. Look, Bao, several people are smiling and begging Su Kaiwu to sit down. Su Kaiji, seeing those smiling tigers, feels a sudden chill. But, even though he is reluctant, he cannot refuse any longer and sits down with a hardened expression. As soon as he sits down, Tea consort eagerly starts feeding him. Something unusual must have a reason behind it. He becomes extra cautious, wondering if the pastries might be poisoned. He politely declines the enthusiasm with a smile, saying he can help himself. He is cautious, but consort Lan across from him seems as if she doesn't have a care in the world, grabbing the pastries and stuffing them into her mouth. She appears to be a real foodie. Seeing someone else eating, Su Kai also cautiously starts to taste the pastries. Consort Jing, quietly observing from the side, uses her teacup as a cover. A smirk curled up at the corner of the lips. The fish took the bait. The facade of peace did not last long, ending with Consort Jing clutching her stomach in pain. The supporting actor hurriedly rushed over, not forgetting to loudly shout, "Sister, what's wrong with you?" Su Kaiji ate pastries with an expressionless face, watching the drama unfold, clueless about what these two were up to. Consort Jing, feigning weakness, spoke with a moving tremor in her voice, "Perhaps I ate something bad. But the pastries were freshly made this morning. Besides, a few of us ate them and seemed fine." In her speech, she seemed to inadvertently glance at the teacup. Could it be a problem with the tea? Su Kaiji observed their back and forth exchange closely. He mused, "Why so enthusiastic just now when you were waiting here for this?" Clearly moved by worldly desires, when will the little emperor admit it? Su Kaiji silently watched them finish their act. If he interrupted now, wouldn't it be a waste of their efforts? Consort Cha, frowning, asked Consort Lan to fetch the imperial physician. She specifically warned her not to make a fuss to avoid implicating Consort Su unnecessarily. That would be unfortunate. Innocent Consort Lan hurried off to fetch the physician, oblivious to the deception. The room quieted down instantly, leaving only the weak Consort Jing, unable to speak, and the seemingly anxious Consort Cha. Consort Cha hadn't expected such a turn of events, that Consort Su could calmly continue drinking tea. She awkwardly initiated, "Sister Consort Su, about today's incident. Su Kaiji is not a soft persimmon to be handled at will. The play is ended, the superficial piece torn apart. No need to pretend any longer." With a curl of his lips, he tore through the last of the pretense. "I didn't know you would come today. Why would I prepare poison tea?" The usually weak Consort Jing suddenly burst out angrily, saying, "I've long heard that you want to drive all the women out of the palace just to monopolize His Majesty. Maybe you've been planning to poison us all along." She wanted to continue but was silenced by a sharp look from Su Kaiji. Seeing that it had finally quieted down, Su Kaiji leisurely propped himself up on the table and slowly walked towards Consort Jing. "Is Consort Jing in pain? Is it here?" he said, pressing a random spot. Consort Jing immediately exaggeratedly screamed in pain. Su Kaiji pressed another spot, and Consort Jing foolishly screamed in pain again. He withdrew his hand and asked, "Is it a sharp pain or a dull ache?" Consort Jing, out of patience, couldn't help but shout, "It just hurts. How can I tell the difference?" Su Kaiji understood and slowly straightened up. Generally, if it's food poisoning, there would be abdominal pain and diarrhea. There's also a chance of stomach and liver pain. He fully straightened up and looked playfully at Consort Jing. If all these places hurt simultaneously, it could be severe poisoning. But you seem full of energy, which doesn't look like severe poisoning. This explanation doesn't quite add up. Consort Jing had no medical knowledge. Hearing this, she began to lose confidence and could only weakly retort, "Are you saying I'm framing you?" The news of Consort Jing being poisoned in Consort Su's palace quickly spread. The young emperor was seriously reviewing memorials when a servant suddenly rushed in. "Your Majesty, Consort Jing seems to have been poisoned in Consort Su's palace." The young emperor finally lifted his head from the pile of memorials. What kind of trouble is Consort Su causing now? Although he outwardly showed disdain, his heart was still drawn to her. It seemed he couldn't continue reading the memorials anymore. The self-conceited young emperor had become jealous. The harem wasn't on fire, but it was in chaos. It seemed like his concubine had cheated on him. Dealing with a rogue like Consort Jing required methods and techniques. Su Kaiwu ordered someone to bring hot water and brewed another pot of tea for Consort Jing. But that rogue Consort Jing didn't give him any face and directly slapped it away. At this moment, Consort Cha, who had been watching from the sidelines, suddenly stood up. "Oh, it's all a misunderstanding. We shouldn't hurt the harmony between sisters." Su Kaiji, with a forced smile, continued to pretend, "This is not ordinary tea. This is rose tea that I specially prepared for Sister Jing. It can beautify and enhance the complexion." Upon hearing this, Consort Jing's face turned green with anger. "Are you saying I'm ugly? Just because you've been favored for a few days, you've become so brazen." Su Kaiwu's attitude remained very sincere. "Sister, you've misunderstood. I did this because I noticed traces of pearl powder on your face earlier. While pearl powder can indeed whiten the skin when used externally, if you don't pay attention to hydration and moisturizing, your face can become very dry." Consort Jing, listening to this analysis, unconsciously blurted out, "Indeed, my skin feels a bit dry after using it." Su Kaiji smoothly continued her words, "That's why I specially prepared these rose teas for Sister. They can not only whiten but also hydrate the skin, achieving two benefits in one." Concubine Jing started to waver. After hesitating for a while, she slowly spoke, "Would you be so kind?" Su Kaiji explained that although he hadn't gone to pay his respects to her before, he had always been thinking about her. After speaking, he passed by her to approach T Concubine, raising his hand to lightly touch her face and feel its texture. Through observation and touch, he could tell her skin condition was still quite good. It was just her slightly protruding belly that didn't match her slender figure. Su Kaiji suggested that she should drink more red bean and koik seed water to dispel dampness and reduce swelling. Upon hearing this, T Concubine immediately beamed with joy. Her belly had puzzled her for a long time, and now that she had found a solution, she was overjoyed. However, this was the first time she had heard of red bean and koik seed water. Finally, Concubine Jing couldn't help but speak up, "Where did you learn all these things? How come I have never heard of them before?" Su Kaiji briefly brushed over the question, merely saying that he had learned some medical skills from a wandering doctor for a few years. Seeing the moment was right, Su Kaiji made his move. With one hand, he beckoned T Concubine, "The reason His Majesty favors me is because of my medical skills." The arrival of His Majesty interrupted their conversation. The young emperor entered just in time to see this scene. That troublemaking Consort Su was hooking arms with the concubines. Perhaps this scene wouldn't normally pose a problem, but the key point was that Su Kaiji was a man. For a moment, the emperor couldn't figure out whom he was being cuckolded by. He coughed twice to suppress the weird feeling in his heart. He coughed twice to suppress the eeriness in his heart, then spoke directly and to the point. "I've heard that Consort Jing was poisoned in Consort Su's palace. Is this true? How can this be so aggressive?" Upon hearing the young emperor questioning whether Consort Jing was poisoned in Consort Su's palace, Consort Cha immediately seized the opportunity to cozy up, taking the emperor's hand and explaining that it was all a misunderstanding. Consort Su also stepped forward to explain that it was indeed a misunderstanding. "I was just explaining the benefits of floral tea to the two sisters." Finally, Consort Jing found an opportunity to chime in. "Sister Consort Su is so impressive, Your Majesty cannot keep her to yourself. Consort Cha truly lives up to her name, with a voice that wafts a strong green tea fragrance. Yes, my sister knows so much, unlike me who knows nothing at all. It's no wonder Your Majesty likes her so much." Consort Su gave a cold and tinged smile. "Is that all Consort Cha amounts to?" He firmly grasped the hand of the incessant Consort Cha. "My sister is not ignorant at all. Didn't you specially bring pastries to see me today?" He emphasized the word specially. Before Consort Cha could grasp his meaning, he looked at the young emperor with a face full of grievance. "Unlike me, who has only been concerned with Your Majesty's well-being and neglected the courtesies of the harem." The next second, the entire room fell into a strange silence, with only the richer scent of green tea wafting through the air. Consort Jing scratched her head somewhat dazedly. Was I just deceived by his innocent appearance? Another green tea character of low significance pouted unhappily. It seems she has met her match. Meanwhile, the center of the incident was focused on Consort Su's hand. Seeing him nonchalantly hooking Consort Cha's hand, she felt extremely uncomfortable. What started as mere displeasure turned into complete unease. With resentment, he dragged the man who had not upheld his male virtues. Su Kaiwu was caught off guard and was pulled directly into his arms. The scent that filled his nostrils was both icy and scorching, a true contradiction. The young emperor didn't know what he was thinking. All he knew was that he didn't want the man near those flirtatious women, even if they were his concubines. His palm pressed down secretly, with a firm grip, his eyes unwaveringly focused on him. Consort Su should indeed mind her manners, he said, his voice layered with meanings only the two of them understood. Su Kaiji let out an ambiguous ah, as his slender fingers slowly crawled up the side of his neck, and then onto his face, boldly placing his entire palm against his cheek. Is your Majesty jealous? The young emperor pushed him away mercilessly. Know your place, and refrain from overstepping boundaries. Just then, a hurried cry came from outside the door. I'm back. Consort Jing, are you all right? The words were cut off by the shocking scene before her eyes. The usually aloof and indifferent emperor was publicly embracing Consort Su in an affectionate manner, while the two consorts beside them looked on with faces full of resentment. His imperial position granted him much power, but it also stripped away many of his freedoms. Expressions of love, so easily uttered by ordinary people, were forbidden for him, for they could become his fatal weakness. The noisy commotion inside the room left the emperor feeling extremely irritated. After confirming that the consort was indeed unharmed, he decided to leave, dropping the words, "Since there's nothing wrong, I will take my leave first." He then grabbed Su Kaiwu and headed for the exit. A few faint rays of light sneaked in from outside, gently falling on Su Kaiji, giving a somewhat romantic vibe of eloping. During this beautiful moment, Su Kaiwu, however, had a mischievous thought. He suddenly broke free from the emperor's grip and wore a troubled expression as the emperor turned to look back at him. Your Majesty, please go ahead. I haven't finished talking with the two consorts yet. The mentioned consorts broke out in a cold sweat, fearing the emperor's wrath might descend upon them. The emperor turned to look at him, his tightly furrowed brows revealing his displeasure. The hand that had been shaken off was still suspended in mid-air, slightly open, waiting for the other to comply. Don't make me say the same thing twice, he said. Su Kaiji's gaze wavered between the lonely king and the concubines, finally landing helplessly on the concubine behind. Sister, you saw it too. I dare not defy His Majesty's orders. I'll have to visit you another day. Concubine Cha smiled insincerely at her. You are so considerate, sister. Next time, we will come visit you instead. After exchanging pleasantries, he walked to Concubine Lan. This Lan concubine was young and naive, retaining such innocence in the scheming palace was rare. He gently stroked her fluffy head and smiled sincerely. Next time, I'll bring you something tasty. Concubine Lan proactively reached out to hold his hand. Thank you, sister. After speaking, Su Kaiwu placed his hand into the lonely king's hand, which had been waiting for a long time. Hand in hand, they swaggered out of the room. After walking for a while, Su Kaiji suddenly shook off the lonely king's hand. The lonely king looked back in surprise, only to hear him say, Your Majesty, it's not appropriate to walk hand in hand like this. Your concubines were watching just now. The lonely king impatiently furrowed his brows, his voice tinged with noticeable arrogance. Do I need to consider others' opinions when I do things? This arrogant demeanor made him all the more appealing. Su Kaiwu's smile became more pronounced. I find that your Majesty is quite tsundere. The lonely king looked at him, puzzled, his handsome brows furrowing deeper. What does tsundere mean? Su Kaiwu, with a serious face, rambled on. It's a term from my hometown, used to compliment someone. The lonely king looked at him suspiciously. Really? Your hometown language doesn't sound like a compliment. His hand discreetly moved to the lonely king's waist, gripping the lean waist to pull the person over. Of course, it's words of praise. His Majesty cherishes me so much among the many concubines, I must certainly compliment His Majesty. The powerful and solitary king was kissed forcefully. The other party is a male doctor who traveled from the modern era. The hand that tightly clasps his waist, and the face that gets closer and closer, every single one of them is provoking and tempting the tight string of the solitary king. Too close, so close that the other's warm breaths are ambiguously intertwining. The solitary king clenches his lips, daring not to move. But the other's domineering aura is about to disrupt his rhythm. He slightly squints his eyes, not sure whether to pull away or get closer. This hesitation gave the other a chance. A warm touch lingered on his lips. Although it was hot, he felt his blood. He felt that his blood had cooled at that moment. Like a terrified rabbit, he suddenly pushed the other away, angrily covering his recently violated thin lips. He wasn't sure if he was stunned by the other's audacity or regretting not pushing him away sooner. Since he couldn't figure it out, he decided to take it out on the other. How improper to be pulling and tugging in public. Su Kaiji acted as if he hadn't heard, and, as if guided by some unseen force, reached out to touch the lingering warmth on his lips. After carefully feeling it for a moment, he spoke. Just now, in public, why didn't your Majesty reprimand me? The solitary king, caught in the act, couldn't find a suitable rebuttal and could only glare at him helplessly. Su Kaiji moved his hand closer to him, step by step breaking down his defenses. Why doesn't your Majesty comfort the other concubines but pulls me along instead? As soon as he finished speaking, the hand covering his mouth was grabbed by the other. The solitary king, still dazed by the lingering sensation, could only come up with a clumsy excuse: "They often bother me. If you could share the burden, I would be grateful." Su Kaiji seriously pondered his words. "Your Majesty has such beautiful concubines but finds them bothersome?" One moment innocent, the next cunning, he kissed the solitary king's long fingers. Then he grasped the other's thumb and brushed it against his own lips, his alluring voice pouring out, "Is it possible that your Majesty also likes men?" The solitary king's temple veins throbbed faintly. Furiously grabbing the other's collar, he pulled him close, speaking the harshest words in the gentlest tone: "I'll tear that mouth of yours sooner or later." Su Kaiwu wasn't afraid of his empty threats. Instead, he moved closer, his heated gaze firmly fixed on the tasted thin lips. "Don't just tear my mouth, you can tear my clothes too." The solitary king was infuriated by his shamelessness. This person's arrogance was too overbearing. He had to find a way to curb it, lest he become reckless. Narrowing his eyes unconsciously, he plotted, "Maybe I should let him and those troublesome concubines deal with each other." Su Kaiwu was very dissatisfied with his distraction, pressing closer and asking, "What is your Majesty thinking about? I am right in front of your Majesty, and yet you can still be distracted by other things?" This solitary king clearly likes his partner's outfit today very much. Just look at those predatory eyes and you'd understand, though he still mischievously makes things difficult. On the day of the palace banquet, every concubine in the palace was dressed splendidly. Only Su Kaiji, being a man, found it cumbersome and simply pinned a hairpin for slight decoration. He felt a headache just looking at all those dazzling accessories. Such tacky aesthetics. Fortunately, this solitary king doesn't like such ostentatious things. He dismissed the maid and wanted to go out for some fresh air. After walking for a while in the palace, he felt something was wrong. Earlier, he was too annoyed to pay attention to the path, and now that he had calmed down, he realized he was lost. He looked around, trying to find the way to the banquet, but to no avail. As a person with no sense of direction, he really regretted not bringing along some attendants. Today the palace banquet was busy, and there were very few people on the road. He couldn't even find anyone to ask for directions. Suddenly, he remembered the secret guard Qing Xuan who saved his life last time. He wondered if Qing Xuan was still secretly protecting him. Holding on to a glimmer of hope, he called out to Qing Xuan into the dark, but before he could get a response, he was interrupted by a strange male voice. "Which family's young lady got lost here?" Su Kaino followed the voice and saw a young man as gentle as jade, looking elegant and dashing. He appraised the unfamiliar man without a change in expression. "Who are you?" The stranger, realizing he hadn't introduced himself, responded with a warm smile that matched his gentle voice. "I am the sixth prince of the palace. My name is Jinking." He lowered his eyes slightly and softly called out "Sixth Prince," then revealed his own identity. "I am His Majesty's consort, my surname is Su." The other party bowed apologetically. "Lady Consort Su, I have been rude. I mistook you for a young lady attending the palace feast." Recalling how he had been looking around, he politely asked if Su was lost. Su Kanong knew it would be difficult to find someone else at this moment and asked if the sixth prince could escort him. The sixth prince nodded slightly. "Of course, it would be my honor. I was on my way to the feast as well. It's a privilege to accompany you." Thus, they teamed up halfway and proceeded to the banquet. Throughout the journey, the sixth prince was very restrained and polite, maintaining a proper distance without overstepping. The banquet had already started to liven up, but the king felt uninterested, idly staring at the entrance as if waiting for someone. When he saw that person arriving with the sixth prince, he was momentarily stunned. How did they come together? Both of them respectfully saluted the king. "Greetings to your Majesty, greetings to the royal brother." The king waved his hand, signaling them to rise from the salute. Su Kaiwu's attire today was not extravagant. Compared to the other consorts, it could even be considered plain. Yet, with a slight smile, he made all the beauty in the world pale in comparison, captivating the heart and soul of the man above. The king stared at him intently, his Adam's apple rolling unconsciously. He felt especially enticing today. The king tapped the table beside him, his intention clear. "What are you waiting for? Come and sit." Seeing him take a seat beside the lonely king, the concubines couldn't hide their bitterness. Thus, unable to hold back, they started looking for trouble. "Ah, Sister Sophie, don't you know it's a palace banquet today? Dressing like this, aren't you embarrassing His Majesty?" These two grown men, instead of deciding who is top or bottom, what victory are they trying to determine? Su Kaiji, with his casual dressing and a bit of tidying up, has completely captivated the lonely king's heart and soul. But beneath this gentle and handsome exterior hides a fierce and unknown beast. Not long after he took his seat, Prince An also hurried over. "I beg your Majesty's pardon, I was delayed by some urgent matters and arrived late." I hope your majesty can forgive me. The lonely king politely said it didn't matter. The banquet became even more lively. The concubines in the palace showed off their dancing skills one after another. Su Kaiwu was just about to comment on how talented and versatile the concubines of the harem were when, in the next second, concubine Jing said it was his turn to go on stage. His mind short-circuited for a moment, and it took him a while to mechanically turn his head to look at the person next to him.
His warm, long fingers lingered ambiguously on his lips. Haven't I told you? Recall, have I not told you to prepare well? Su Kai felt somewhat wronged and glared at him. But your majesty didn't say what to prepare for. The king released him, but the smile at the corner of his mouth became more evident. As my consort, do you still need me to spell out every little detail? He really wanted to argue back with full confidence, but the looks from those around him pressed down, leaving him speechless. Helplessly, he sighed and resigned himself to his bad luck, pondering what to do next. The king, on the other hand, leisurely sipped his tea, curious to see how consort Su would solve this dilemma. Suddenly, Su Kaiji caught sight of the milk wine and strong liquor on the table. He had an idea. He borrowed the wine cup gifted by the Snow Country from the king. I'm indeed not good at dancing. Let me perform a magic trick for your majesty and the guests instead. He poured the bright red petal juice as the base liquid and then added the clear strong liquor into the cup. The audience below mocked consort Su for his lack of sophistication, thinking he was trying to deceive them with something so simple. Unperturbed by their mockery, Su Kaiji continued his preparation calmly. The moment to witness the miracle was approaching. He poured the liquid from the small cup into the larger one. In the next second, the scene in the large cup changed dramatically, forming something resembling a jellyfish. The courtiers below were stunned. Thunderous applause filled the entire hall instantly, even the king's eyes hid a trace of astonishment. Su Kaiji held the cup towards the lone king to offer blessings, wishing his majesty everlasting happiness and peace. Yet, in those shining eyes gazing at him, the message was clear: I've won this round. Soon after, a servant came to report that the fireworks were ready. The lone king then invited everyone to follow him and enjoy the display. The next moment, however, he was plunged into the midst of women's rivalry. It was all quite overwhelming. The lone king had not been troubled for long before Su Kaiji pulled him away. Your majesty, it's too crowded here and may cause difficulty breathing, which could trigger your heart condition. Therefore, it's better for you to come with me. And just like that, the lone king found himself falling into his embrace, like a small rabbit trapped in a snare. From this heart-fluttering scene, it wasn't hard to discern how far their relationship had progressed. The fireworks banquet had already begun, yet the lone king didn't quite enjoy the overly noisy and bustling scene, his brows furrowing ever deeper. Just then, someone seemingly oblivious to reading the room came to bother him. He turned around, about to scold the person, but upon realizing it was Su Kaiwu, all his irritation vanished like smoke. He even allowed his hand to be held without any resistance. Under the accompaniment of fireworks, we arrived at the deserted upstairs. After walking for a while, the king pretended to be angry. The banquet hasn't ended, and you just dragged me away like this. What kind of behavior is this? Su Kaiwu didn't look back and continued to pull him. The fireworks won't stop just because His Majesty isn't there. Not until finding the best viewing spot did Su Kaiwu agree to stop. Does your majesty think you can watch the fireworks quietly in a place like that? The six-colored fireworks bloomed recklessly, and the mixed colors also reflected on them. Every cluster of fireworks bloomed in the king's eyes, softening his complicated feelings. He had been in the palace for so many years, yet this was his first time having such an experience, unfamiliar but not unwelcoming. He couldn't help but turn his head to look at that person. At this moment, all those troubling worries seemed to be put aside. Suddenly, Su Kaiji turned his head unexpectedly, catching his gaze that was too late to withdraw. Why are you looking at me instead of the fireworks, your majesty? Could it be? As the other party kept getting closer, the king seemed to hear his own heart beating violently, just like the fervently blooming fireworks, pounding non-stop. Their soft bodies finally touched, entangling among the surging crowd and the sound of fireworks. After a long kiss, Su Kaiji reluctantly let go of him, his cheerful tone revealing his mood at the moment. This time, your majesty didn't resist me. The king blushed and turned away, but was then pulled into an embrace by the other party. His sensitive ears were also assaulted by the hot breath of alcohol from the other party, and finally, his earlobe was lightly bitten by the other party. A feeling indescribable spread throughout his body instantly. Su Kaiji gave the shy king a look back. I have a question I've always wanted to ask your majesty. I hope your majesty can answer truthfully. The king hummed to signal him to continue. Su Kaiwu slowly approached him. I've always wanted to know what your majesty's name is. The king suddenly became serious. How dare you? My name is not something you can call casually. Sukai Wu's hand gently brushed over his chest. In our hometown, people who get married call each other by their names or affectionate terms, looking intently at the person in front of them. Even though I can't call you that, can I at least know your majesty's name? Jingxi, the lonely king, reported his name, and even reached out to tuck his hair. No matter how you behaved in the past, in this royal city, you must follow the rules. If you dare to call me by my name casually, you'll lose your head. Sukai Wu moved closer to him, close enough for their noses to touch, their breaths intertwining. Can I call you by your name when it's just the two of us? Like in the bedchamber at night? The lonely king was indeed a bit domineering and handsome this time, but the lower position was still his. Sukaiji, truly worthy of being someone who traveled from modern times, was more open-minded. He directly asked if he could call his name when it's just the two of them, especially in the bedchamber at night. The lonely king couldn't handle his enthusiasm, blushing slightly and took half a step back to distance himself. But how could Sukaiji let such a delicious lonely king go? He stepped forward half a step, bringing their distance to 0. His burning gaze unabashedly fell on his slightly flushed face. Your Majesty, you really blush easily. The two of them flirted openly, completely unaware that they had been discovered. From a distance, the sixth prince watched in some shock at the two close figures. It seemed like the elder brother was doing this for the first time, something somewhat improper. He lightened his steps and slowly walked towards them. Elder brother, Empress, brother Emperor, it's time for Her Majesty to return to the banquet. When I, the solitary king, turned back to look at him, it seemed as if his face was filled with resistance. Why is it you? The sixth prince respectfully saluted. Eunuch Joe couldn't get away and it wasn't appropriate to randomly send someone over, so they sent me instead. Then he kindly reminded that some court officials were dissatisfied with the brother emperor and consort Su's actions. You might have to endure a few words later. The solitary king felt a slight shock in his heart but didn't show it. It's not their place to meddle in such trifles. Sure enough, as soon as we returned to the banquet, I saw those court officials waiting for him with solemn expressions. He instructed the two people behind him to wait there, and he went alone to deal with the unreasonable accusations. As soon as the solitary king approached, those court officials started, Your Majesty, the banquet hasn't ended yet. How could you leave first? Another court official immediately echoed, Your Majesty disregards so many guests and leaves alone with a consort. What kind of example does this set? Listening to their accusations, the solitary king frowned. I merely left for a short while. Is there a need to exaggerate like this? Seeing that he wouldn't listen, another minister continued on his own, Your Majesty must prioritize the important matters. You must not be led astray by beauty. His demeanor was like educating an ignorant child, making Sukai Wu want to twist his head off and kick it like a ball. The next second, those two court officials were frightened by the solitary king's loud roar, a loud "How dare you!" made the incessantly talking two tremble terribly. The solitary king sarcastically curved his lips. What, just because I was gone for a moment, the banquet can't go on without me? Is it that you can't eat or drink? To label me with being led astray by beauty, aren't you being a bit too hasty? Just then, Prince An suddenly came over, trying to smooth things over with a conciliatory tone, Your Majesty, please don't be annoyed. They are just worried about you. When the solitary king's gaze turned sharp, he constantly threw dagger looks at outsiders. I wondered why they dared to speak so boldly. It turns out they were conveying messages on behalf of the royal uncle. This particular solitary king possesses the appearance of a top, yet lacks the potential to be one, and his top, Sukai Wu, only needed a second to pin him down. Taking advantage of the brief moment their eyes met, Sukaiji and the sixth prince sneaked away while the others were busy. Sukai Wu thought his sneaking plan was foolproof, unaware that the solitary king had already seen through his little trick. The two made their way to a small path for a walk and chat, away from the battlefield. Just as the sixth prince turned around intending to say something, he wasn't paying attention to where he was stepping and fell backward. In the moment of the fall, the sixth prince's mind went blank. Fortunately, Sukai Wu, with his quick reflexes, caught him, preventing an intimate encounter with the cold ground. The waist he was held by seemed to be subtly heating up, the warmth spreading up to his cheeks. The sixth prince, somewhat embarrassed, lowered his head and thanked the other. Seeing the other's troubled and unhappy expression, he took a half step aside, retreating to a safe distance before speaking, Is Your Majesty worried about the emperor? Sukaiji responded nonchalantly with a hum, indicating his acknowledgement. Upon hearing that it was the solitary king's first time doing such an outrageous act, Sukai Wu was clearly taken aback. The first time? Why does the solitary king, in the eyes of others, he, who never did anything out of line, stepped into the emperor's bedroom with his temporarily unsolvable puzzle, dozing off by the bedside waiting for the lonely king to return. When the lonely king returned and saw the visitor, his steps involuntarily lightened, but those barely audible footsteps still clearly fell into Tsukaiji's ears, who opened his somewhat blurry green eyes. "Has His Majesty been lectured until this late?" The lonely king slowly approached him, feeling somewhat excited but showing none of it on his face. "Were you waiting for me?" Tsukaiji, with his sleepy and sticky voice, hummed, easily climbing onto the lonely king's shoulder and pulling him over. "After all, I'm fully responsible for this matter, so naturally, I should be the first to care about His Majesty." The lonely king let out a somewhat disdainful laugh. "Don't worry, it's not their turn to lecture me." Tsukaiji, with a smile on his lips, approached his ear. "Is that so? How come I've heard that His Majesty used to be quite obedient?" The scorching heat wave and teasing words were attacking his tightly wound nerve. He pushed the other slightly, giving an outlet to this tense and ambiguous atmosphere. "Did Jing Qing tell you that?" Tsukaiji chuckled lowly. "No, I dreamt about it in my dreams." At this, the lonely king suddenly became jealous, looking at him with an unfriendly face. "I haven't even asked where you and my imperial brother went halfway." Tsukaiji answered carelessly, "Nowhere much, just took a walk, chatted, and admired the moon." The lonely king, somewhat dissatisfied, grabbed his hand and pulled him into his embrace. "My consort, shamelessly chatting and admiring the moon with another man?" Tsukaiji looked at him amused. "Is His Majesty jealous?" "I'm teaching you manners." Teasing the stubborn lonely king was really interesting. He directly pinned him down on the bed. The allure of his green schemes peered deeply into his eyes, as ambiguous words fell in turn. "Do you need me to promise to only walk, chat, and admire the moon with you in the future?" Saying so, he even deliberately leaned into his ear in a different tone. The called lonely king's heartbeat suddenly accelerated, and a blush quickly crawled up his face. His threats at this moment seemed even more powerless. "If you continue to be so presumptuous, there will be a price to pay." The other party was unmoved, instead lazily dragging the tone to ask, "Oh? What price?" This is a comic that turns readers into head pushers, always missing someone to push those two heads a bit closer during every deeply affectionate moment of eye contact. Just like now, when the two are lying together on the bed, the lonely king's back against the headboard. In front of him was the audacious Sukai Wu. The lonely king slowly lifted his eyelids to look at the person on top of him. When the emperor uncle left, I saw his expression and guessed he was about to make a move. The person on top nonchalantly raised an eyebrow. "Oh, then your majesty better be careful." Seeing his unconcerned demeanor, the lonely king frowned slightly. "That's something you should say to yourself. You probably won't have any days of leisure either." The other party lightly lifted his chin, those green eyes mixed with too many thoughts staring intently at him, seemingly trying to see through something through those eyes. "Would your majesty bear to see me in danger?" The lonely king did not answer immediately, closed his eyes to think for a while, before gently pushing him away. "You're on your own." The weather was nice the next day. Sukai Wu, who didn't get the solitary king's assurance, planned to go to the library to find a way to save her life. Princeton is about to make a move, so there's no way to get his medicine. As he mainly practices Western medicine and has almost completely forgotten traditional Chinese medicine, he needs to look up information and brush up on it. Unexpected yet not surprising, he was stopped at the door due to his identity as a woman. It seems this dynasty is still very feudal. The whole "a woman without virtue is akin to lacking talent" is still not obsolete. He tried to use grand reasoning to persuade the guard, but the man was unyielding and refused to let him pass. It was really frustrating. This scene was caught by the eyes of the sixth prince from a distance. He couldn't help but chuckle. He was still as surprising in his speech as ever. The guard was still arguing with Sukai Wu, refusing to let him pass. The sixth prince quickened his pace and approached, saying, "What if I vouch for him?" Sukai Wuji withdrew from the argument, turned her head to look aside. The sixth prince gave her a bow. "My lady." Sukai Wuji replied indifferently, "What a coincidence, meeting again." But then she thought, why does she encounter this guy wherever she goes? Could it be that he has a camera on her? The sixth prince was unaware of her brainstorming. He politely looked at the guard. "I may enter, right?" The guard quickly answered, "Of course, your highness, everyone in the palace knows your love for books, and your highness often comes to the library, so naturally you may enter." As the guard nodded, he asked, "What if I bring her with me?" This time, the guard still wouldn't allow it. The expression of the sixth prince immediately darkened. The imperial brother has never explicitly forbidden women from entering the library. It's always been an unwritten rule. Besides, this lady has saved His Majesty's life with her exceptional medical skills. She is not just anybody. If such a person wishes to consult some medical books, there's no reason to deny entry. As a married man, Su Kaining flirted with 2 innocent men in a single day. He truly lives up to his reputation as the ultimate seducer. In the end, Su Kaining managed to enter the library as he wished. However, what transpired inside was quite beyond his comprehension. He couldn't understand the characters in the books at all, so he had to seek help from the person who entered the library with him. To his surprise, the other person quickly agreed to his request. The 6th prince joked that he could help, but how would Her Majesty repay Jinking? Su Kaining lightly lifted the other's chin with the book scroll in his hand, leaned in, and softly asked the 6th prince what he wanted. Despite the teasing, the 6th prince froze for a moment, then his face turned completely red. He gently pushed away the scroll and quickly turned his head, his voice becoming a bit weaker. Her Majesty can owe me for now. Jinking will come to you when he figures out what he wants. On one side, things were going smoothly, but on the other side, the lonely king seemed quite desolate. He hadn't seen Su Kaining all day and was becoming increasingly irritable. He then asked a servant to bring Quang Xuan over. The highly skilled Quang Xuan arrived quickly. "What can I do for you, my emperor brother? Is there any news from Consort Su today?" Quang Xuan touched his own smooth little face and replied, "Consort Su went to the library with Prince Jinking today. There's nothing unusual for now, and I haven't noticed any actions from Prince In." After hearing his report, the lonely king's frown deepened. "With Jinking? Alone?" Quang Xuan didn't understand why he asked so specifically but still honestly answered, "Yes." He then asked, "Is there a problem?" "Prince Jinking looks very frail, he probably wouldn't harm Consort Su." The lonely king huffed and flicked his sleeves, and a sour jealousy instantly poured out. It was true that it wouldn't hurt him. Hearing this, Qing Xuan became even more confused. Someone to take care of the concubine, isn't that good? But why did the emperor brother look so unhappy? The lonely king let out an almost inaudible sigh and had to say to him earnestly, "You are still young. Some things you will understand in the future." After speaking, he dismissed everyone. After everyone left, the air pressure around the lonely king seemed to drop even more. It seemed that he needed to take good care of his little brother. Meanwhile, Qing Xuan frowned at Sukaiji's carelessly left manuscript. What kind of script is this? Why had he never seen it before? He could only take his confusion to find Sukaiji. By this time, it was already late. He didn't beat around the bush and directly explained to Sukaiwu, "Today I saw the concubine sister's manuscript in the library, but I have never seen the characters on it. Is the concubine sister from a foreign land?" Su Keilong glanced at the Chinese characters on the manuscript and panicked for a moment. He had been careless. So, he could only earnestly make up a story, saying that he had never been to school and had only apprenticed under a traveling doctor, and that his master had taught him the script. It was only yesterday that he discovered their scripts were not the same. The naive Qing Xuan was quickly fooled. Sukaiji was quite fond of this simple little guy. He lightly tapped the other's nose with his finger and said, "It's getting late. Now that you know, you should get some rest." In the next moment, the little guard's face turned red. I won't rest. Concubine sister, you should rest early. I will protect you well from outside." After saying that, she ran out with her face blushing. Sukaiji's mouth curved in a seemingly existent smile. It's still easy to coax kids. A crafty one not only takes the initiative to attack but also leads the prey into his trap. As for Sukaiji's nonsensical talk, the solitary king has already grown accustomed to it. He took the water and drank a big gulp. A warm flow made him feel much more comfortable. "You dare to act up in such times only." Sukai casually took his teacup and spoke softly, "Does your majesty know what you just did?" "What?" He sat down on the bed indifferently and even gently embraced him, but his eyes were teasing. "Your majesty just called me daddy and held on to me saying how much you missed me." The solitary king instantly became furiously embarrassed, raised his hand intending to teach this ignorant person a lesson, but the hand that reached out was instead caught by the other, and his lean waist was also seized. "Your majesty might not be able to deal with me now. It's better to wait until your body has recovered before you make a move." The solitary king's face turned as black as the bottom of a pot instantly. "I need to pick a day to deal with you?" Sukai couldn't help but burst into laughter. Did ancient people really say such lines? His restless hand moved up from the waist, and everywhere it passed was fiery hot. Finally stopped at his chest, with some of his weight also shared onto the person beneath him. "Not only do we need to see the date, but also consider the situation." As he spoke, he suddenly lowered his head, the distance between them instantly shortened, and the ambiguous atmosphere filled the entire space. "For instance, right now, it seems that dealing with your majesty is not impossible." The lonely king took a deep breath. When it came to how to handle himself,
He was thinking about how to respond, but the person on top suddenly got up and retreated to a safe distance. The lonely king was clearly still recovering when he heard that person say, "Taking advantage of someone is not my style. Your Majesty, rest well." Saying this, he waved his hand to leave. "The room is temporarily lent to your Majesty. I'm going somewhere else to develop medicine." Hearing his words, the lonely king immediately felt energized. "Lent to me? Everything in the palace belongs to me, including you." Tsukaiji sighed helplessly. "Ah, right, you're sick, everything you say is right." The next day, the lonely king was walking in the palace as usual but was suddenly grabbed by Tsukaiji. "Your Majesty, come with me." The other person raised an eyebrow. "Where are you taking me so disrespectfully?" Tsukai playfully winked at him. "Your Majesty's health has recovered, hasn't it? I have a little surprise prepared to celebrate." He smiled brightly at Eunuch Joe. Seeing their affectionate manner, Eunuch Joe's heart was filled with joy. "Your Majesty and the Empress's matters are naturally not something this old servant can manage." But the lonely king didn't seem to want to cooperate. He patted Tsukaiji's hand, indicating that it was getting late and he wanted to rest early. Tsukaiji held his hand and pulled him back. "Your Majesty will definitely like it. Do you trust me?" The burning sensation was not from a hot pot but from the other person's strong and domineering advances. Regarding the little surprise that Tsukai spoke of, the lone king wore a look of disinterest on his face, but still let him pull himself to the so-called place of surprise. Tsukaiji took him to an outside pavilion and mysteriously pulled back the curtains. Dang! The lone king looked at the full table of items in front of him and was momentarily lost for words. "What is this?" Tsukai seemed very pleased with this little surprise and began to enthusiastically introduce it after sitting down. "This thing is called hot pot. It is a specialty of our hometown. It's also a feast I've especially prepared for your Majesty to relieve any shock." The lone king's lips curled slightly. "In all the world, there is actually a delicacy I do not know about?" Hearing his words, Tsukaiji just smiled slightly. "The world is so vast, can your Majesty guarantee to understand every local custom?" He fished out the cooked meat and didn't forget to remind the lone king how to eat it deliciously. The lone king stared at the piece of meat in his hand and cast a soul-searching question. "Do I have to personally make such an effort?" Having said that, he lifted his arms in a manner as though if no one fed him, he would starve to death. Such a little emperor is truly adorable and charming to the extreme. Tsukai immediately conceded, laboriously dipped the freshly cooked meat in sauce, and even felt a teasing impulse. "Do you need me to feed you, my dear?" The other party did not respond, but directly grabbed his hand and moved it towards his own mouth. In this intimate pose, he ate the meat that entered his mouth. It was indeed very delicious, more so than any delicacy he had tasted, but Tsukai told him to not praise it yet, as the main event was still to come. As he said this, he placed a cup of wine in front of the prince. Just as the prince was about to drink, he started coughing from being choked by the wine. It took him a while to recover. "Why does this wine taste different from what I usually drink?" "Because it's mixed with several different wines. This will give the ordinary wine a different taste." Pairing hot pot with wine, happiness is in hand. Soon, the prince felt tipsy. Tsukai seized the opportunity to get closer. His voice, after drinking, became even more enchanting. "I have a question that I've always wanted to ask your Majesty. What kind of person am I in your Majesty's heart?" The prince, with alcohol clouding his mind, pondered seriously. "You are someone I have never seen before. I have stayed in the palace for so many years and met many kinds of people. For the vast majority, I can tell what they are thinking with just one glance, but you are the only one I cannot see through. Clearly, you are the prince's uncle's man, yet you seem to stand on my side." Tsukai felt a string in his heart being gently plucked. He gently embraced the person in his arms. "Your Majesty jests. I am your Majesty's consort." Alcohol was influencing them again. The prince's eyes reddened unconsciously, and he even gently pinched his chin. "What consort? Since when do men become consorts?" As soon as the words were spoken, the other party launched a fierce attack. A fresh yet sharp breath instantly surrounded him. Yet, the verbal sparring was strong and fiery, neither willing to back down even a little bit, only entangled and sinking together. The gentle evening breeze slowly blew, and the prince heard the greeting brought by the wind from the other party. The person said, "My heart and my being entirely belong to your Majesty. The lonely king, soft and vulnerable after drinking, is just too endearing." Such temptation, how could Tsukaiji resist? His whole body leaned toward the other, thin lips seeking that warmth and softness. Upon contact, they passionately entwined. The cool evening breeze blew gently, yet their bodies were unbearably hot, until the person was kissed until they were weak and could no longer stand.
Sukai Wu reluctantly helped them into the house. Whether it was the alcohol or the intoxicating kisses, the lonely king's cheeks were flushed. Uncertain of the night, Sukai Wu also didn't know if he could understand his own words, talking to himself, "Take off your clothes before sleeping, or you'll reek of alcohol." As soon as he finished speaking, the lonely king hummed and raised his hand, as if waiting for someone to undress him. This look was incredibly endearing. Sukai Wu couldn't help but raise his hand and gently touched his head, his tone both tender and affectionate. "If only you were always this well-behaved." The drunken lonely king fell into a deep sleep as soon as he touched the bed. Sukaiji silently stayed by his side. "Because you are here, life, which was unbearably dull, seems not so difficult anymore." He restrainedly touched the other's face and said, "I really want to take you to my hometown." Before he could finish, his hand was caught by the other. Caught off guard, Sukai Wu lost his balance and fell forward, ending up solidly in the embrace of the little drunkard. The distance between them suddenly closed, and Sukaiji could clearly see his furrowed brows. Long fingers gently massaged him, and after a while, the furrowed brows finally relaxed. Sukai Wu also lay down, holding the person beside him tightly in his arms. Anyone in this treacherous palace must feel very lonely. There's nobody to trust, just like him in the past, always dining alone. His parents were too busy to care for him. Every mention of school parent-child activities would be flatly rejected by his mother. The excuses were always the same: Dad had surgeries, and Mom had meetings, they were too busy. Sukai Wu had been rejected so many times that he began to feel numb, not understanding whether it was the parent-child activities or he himself that was unimportant in his parents' eyes. Every time he saw other kids with their parents, he felt an emptiness inside, a stark contrast to the others. He wished he could have his parents' company all year round like those children, but he knew it was just wishful thinking. He put away those vulnerable emotions he shouldn't have and sensibly explained the situation to his teacher. The teacher patted his head sympathetically, as if to show pity for his plight, making the glances from others even more embarrassing. The happy voices and laughter of children and adults were clear in his ears, while he could only sit below alone, indifferently watching these irrelevant events. The beautiful attacker you've been looking forward to has finally dressed as a man. But because of the plot, there will be a bit of torment. Sukai Wu enjoys listening to light music through his headphones while reading a book, which, for him, is a rare treat. That day, as usual, he was listening to music and reading a book when his mother suddenly stormed over, directly pulled off his headphones, and ended his good mood for the day. "How can you be so inconsiderate? Wearing headphones all day long, not even greeting the guests when they come." Sukai Wu slowly shifted his gaze from the book. "Isn't it enough for you to greet them? They're not here to see me anyway." Sue's mom was obviously very dissatisfied with his response. "How can they not be here to see you? Their daughter is the same age as you and also studying medicine. They want to exchange experiences with you." Sukaiji coldly snatched back his headphones. "Did you ask for my opinion? Do I have to put on a smiling face for everyone who comes?" Sue's mom sighed helplessly. She looked like she was educating a disobedient child. "Now the guests are already here. The girl is quite easy to get along with, gentle and always smiling. It's no loss to chat with her." Sukai Wu expressionlessly forced a smile. "Fine, I'll chat." Following his parents' wishes, he approached the girl. The girl did indeed look warm and cheerful, as his mom had said. But so what? He wasn't interested anyway, but he still patiently took a seat next to her. "I heard you want to exchange experiences with me." The girl hugged the pillow tightly. "Yes, I heard you always top your exams. I wanted to ask if you have any tips." For such a boring conversation starter, Sukai Wu had no extra patience and just smiled and said, "Just use your hands." Hearing his words, the girl was stunned for a moment, then quickly regained her composure and sweetly asked, "Since you're so good, could you teach me?" Sukaiji didn't directly answer. He raised a few slender fingers, looking at him teasingly. "Tutoring is usually 300 per session, 20% off for acquaintances." In reality, he's not short of money. He just couldn't be bothered with such tedious things and tedious people, hoping to send them away quickly. As expected, upon hearing Sukaiji's quote, the girl immediately stood up and made an excuse to leave. The parents, standing at the door, exchanged pleasantries for a while before dispersing. After the door was closed with a bang, Sue's mother began lecturing him again. Regarding his parents urging to get married, he remained indifferent. But this time, the other side wasn't planning to give in. "Mom isn't asking you to get married right after graduation, but look at you, you're already this old and haven't even dated anyone. At least interact with some girls." Sukaiji's face still bore that indifferent look, but his tone became a bit more serious. "Maybe there's a possibility that I don't like girls." The moment his words fell, The entire room plunged into an unprecedented silence. Sue's father's brows and eyes showed signs of anger. "Do you know what you're saying? How can you say something like that?" Tsukaiji calmly stated, "I'm very clear about what I'm saying." The next second, Sue's father's slap landed on his face. The red palm print was clearly visible on his fair face. It turns out not all love is accepted by society. At least, in the matter of coming out, Tsukaiji faced strong resistance from his biological parents. "If you weren't part of my life before, why try to interfere with my life now?" Tsukaiji was amused and angered by his parents' attitude. No matter what, they always had the excuse of being busy with work, and then as parents, they naturally intervened in his affairs. He gently touched the spot where his father's slap had landed, his voice as cold as emotionless machinery. "I wasn't joking when I said I didn't like girls." He made him realize his own orientation. It was during his internship that he met a fellow intern named Yi Ming. Whenever he encountered those infatuated and troublesome female patients, Yi Ming would always appear in time, naturally taking the clipboard from his hands, and completing the rest of the examination work for him. At first, he just thought that the person was perhaps too kind-hearted, but later, he discovered that the man was very confident in his abilities, and indeed, he had the capital to be proud. With more interactions, he slowly found that not only was the other's appearance outstanding, but he was also excellent in all aspects beyond words. However, Tsukaiji did not dislike him. Besides wanting to surpass him, there was also a desire to have him. As the internship was about to end, he called him out. Without giving the other any chance to prepare, he confessed his feelings. The other's face showed a moment of astonishment. He didn't give the other a chance to breathe. His slender fingers touched his collar, and he seriously said, "I'm not drunk, nor am I joking." His well-defined hand gently brushed the other's pristine collar. "My body and I have seriously confirmed this." Being confessed to by someone of the same sex, Yi Ming remained calm as usual, and was still able to ask calmly if it was because he had helped him before. Tsukaiji shook his head slightly, "Not entirely. You're excellent in every aspect, excellent to the point of being captivating." Yi Ming chuckled lightly, "To be acknowledged by someone as excellent as you, I feel very honored as well. But sorry, I'm straight. After having some peach crisps, I'm back." Hearing his words, Tsukaiji's mood instantly brightened, and the corners of his mouth uncontrollably curved upwards in excitement. Then he bent his lips meaningfully. "So that's how it is." Although the Mandarin duck bath didn't happen, Tsukaiji didn't miss out on any of the perks he was supposed to get. When Tsukaiwu hurried to the emperor's sleeping quarters, Jingxi was taking a bath. The eunuch Zhou outside was about to speak, but Tsukaiwu stopped him. He planned to surprise the person inside and gently push the door open. He signaled the maids with lip movements, indicating that he would serve the emperor. The maids didn't understand what he was up to but still did as he asked. Just like usual, a maid said, "Your Majesty, allow me to serve you during your bath." After speaking, she was called out by eunuch Zhou, who was careful not to let anyone disturb the person inside. Eunuch Zhou thoughtfully closed the door for them. Tsukaiwu deliberately slowed his pace as he walked in. He thought his plan was flawless, but from the moment he entered the room, to play along with him, Tsukaiwu looked at him and curled his lips, immediately imagining many colorful scenes in his mind, one wave of risque thoughts following another. He carefully picked up the towel and wiped Jingxi's body, starting with his tempting collarbones, then sliding down to his elastic chest muscles, and further down to his neatly defined six-pack abs. Jingxi reached out to grab that provoking hand. "That's enough," he said. Tsukaiji raised his eyebrows in mild surprise. "Your Majesty knew it was me? Why didn't you say so earlier?" The tips of Jingxi's ears turned faintly red, but he still tried to maintain his composure, putting on a prideful demeanor. "You are distracting me from my tasks." Tsukaiwu lowered his head to meet Jingxi's gaze. "I heard your Majesty had just summoned Lady Lan, and then sent her away." As he spoke, he leaned in closer, close enough to kiss the top of her head with a slight bow, but Tsukaiwu didn't make a move, only asking, "Why?" Jingxi pushed the person behind him away slightly. "Why do you seem to know everything about whom I summon?" He suddenly reached out and grabbed Tsukaiji's collar, pulling him closer. "Could it be that Lady Su is jealous?" Tsukaiwu was not one to easily admit his faults, and his tone grew more flippant. "I'm just worried that your Majesty might have some hidden ailment." He pretended to look down seriously. "If your Majesty feels embarrassed to discuss it with the royal physician, you can tell me. I know a thing or two about treatment methods." Suddenly, Jingxi stood up abruptly, his uncovered body exposed to the air, fully under Tsukaiwu's gaze. Yet he showed no sign of nervousness or discomfort. Instead, he teased Tsukaiwu, moving closer to him with his body still damp and warm, provocatively pinching Tsukaiwu's chin, and fearlessly meeting his gaze. Don't you know very well whether I have any hidden ailments? If two people want a sweet and lasting relationship, one of them inevitably has to play the role of zero. Tsukaiji's provocation successfully draws out the other's fiery passion. Jingxi brushed on his clothes with lightning speed, then, full of attack, pushed Sukai-Wu towards the bed, but as they reached the edge of the bed, his hand was caught in a counter-grip. Alarms went off in Jingxi's head, feeling like something undesirable was about to happen the next second. Sure enough, Sukai-Wu flipped the situation, pinning him onto the bed and took the dominant position. "I've already told your majesty, I'm not used to being on the bottom." Jingxi's temples throbbed intensely. "Neither am I," he replied. After hearing his words, Tsukaiji felt both frustrated and helpless, and eventually lay down with his clothes on, suppressing the desire inside. "Really? Ask your heart if you truly can't accept it." Seeing no response, he intensified his teasing. "Then why has your majesty never really pushed me away?" He gently played with the long hair by his ear, his eyes tender as if they could drip with gentleness. "I remember everything your majesty said last time you were unwell." He then hugged him tighter. "Your majesty, you're not alone anymore." The atmosphere was ripe for romance, but Sukai-Wu was reluctant to force anything. He simply drew closer, following his heart, giving the other the chance to push him away at any time. Jingxi did not push him away in the end. Their warmth intertwined, as if expressing the unspoken fondness. After a long period of tenderness, Tsukaiji finally released his lips and shifted to forehead against forehead, nose to nose. "I will always be by your side, as someone you can trust and rely on." For a moment, Jingxi was stunned. In this deceptive and scheming palace, no one had ever said such things to him. Whether it was the consorts or court officials, while they feared his high position, yet he controls his supreme power, only this person in front of him claims to become someone he can trust and rely on. Tsukaiji doesn't know his heart's journey. That voice remains as gentle as it was just now. "Except for that matter, I can respect you in everything else, Jingxi." A glimmer of hope and determination appears in Jingxi's eyes. "Can I truly trust you?" The hopeful and earnest mood of the other party deeply touches his heart. Tsukaiji soothes his face reassuringly, his gaze more serious than ever. "Since I have spoken, I will certainly not deceive your majesty." With the promise received, Jingxi finally smiles. At that moment, he realizes that he too can be easily satisfied. After a gentle exchange of gazes, the two embrace and fall asleep, destined for a dreamless, good night's rest. In a comic with two male leads, the bottom looks quite submissive, which is understandable. But why does Wang, a villain, also seem more submissive? It's been raining heavily for several days recently, causing severe flooding in many places. Therefore, the urgency of flood control and relief is especially pressing. Wang volunteers proactively, taking the initiative. "This matter has always been handled by me in the past. Let me take full charge of it this year as well." The emperor who used to be manipulated by others is no more. Jingxi's gaze falls coldly upon him, his voice carrying a sense of oppression. "The relief work is laborious, and you, uncle, have also suffered over these years. This year, there's a new official in the Ministry of Revenue. I think it would be better to assign him to gain some experience and to alleviate some of the burden from you, uncle." Just as a new official is about to step forward and volunteer, Wang subtly blocks him from doing so. "Hold on, your majesty is not aware.